Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Mike parked the car in front of the house with a smile on his face. He held a bouquet of white lilies, Rachel's favorite, and felt a simple but profound satisfaction in surprising her. Leaving work early was rare for him, but that week, he had noticed the growing distance between them, each stuck in their routines. Determined to rekindle the connection that brought them together, he planned a special dinner, one he would prepare himself, knowing it was something Rachel would love. As he walked toward the door, the sky was already darkening, and the porch lights cast a warm glow. The moment he stepped inside, silence greeted him, but one thing caught his attention: the music. It was a soft melody, muffled, as if coming from another floor. Mike's heart quickened, not with worry but with curiosity. Rachel often played music when she was relaxing, reading a book, or tidying up the house. He imagined finding her on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with a glass of wine in hand. "Rachel," he called out, but his voice was swallowed by the distant music. He placed the flowers on the living room table and began climbing the stairs, paying attention to every detail. The familiar lavender scent from a diffuser lingered in the hallway, but something felt different. There was an energy in the air, something he couldn't immediately identify. The upstairs lights were on, casting shadows through the door frames, and his steps slowed. He climbed each step carefully, as though he didn't want the sound of his shoes to disrupt the mystery of the moment. Reaching the top of the stairs, he paused, tilting his head to listen more closely. The music came from the bedroom, but now he could hear something else: a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for him to recognize that it was Rachel. She was talking. He couldn't make out every word, but her tone seemed animated, almost nervous. A sinking feeling began to form in his chest, as if his instincts were warning him about something his mind had yet to grasp. Mike walked down the hallway, his breathing heavier. He passed the photos on the wall, pictures from trips and happy moments that felt both recent and distant. As he neared the bedroom door, he noticed it was slightly ajar. The warm yellow light spilled through the crack, drawing a bright line on the hallway floor. He stopped, hesitating for a moment. Was he being irrational to think something was wrong? Maybe she was just on the phone with her mom or dealing with something trivial. But the feeling wouldn't leave him, as if something unseen was pulling him into that room, insisting he needed to know what was happening. Rachel's laughter hit him like a punch to the chest. It wasn't her usual laugh, the kind he knew from when she watched comedies or recalled something funny. This was different. Nervous. Forced, even. He leaned closer, and now her words were clearer. "You're not afraid he'll catch us?" Rachel said, her voice carrying a tone he couldn't quite place. Mike's heart raced in a way he hadn't felt since his high school football days. Heat rose to his neck while a chill ran down his spine. He steadied himself against the wall, taking deep breaths to calm down. He didn't want to rush in and create a scene, but every fiber of his being screamed for answers. Her words echoed in his mind, every syllable a riddle he needed to solve. Who was she talking to? Why did she sound so uneasy, so different? He knew he was about to face something that would change the course of the night. Mike stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what he'd just heard. His thoughts raced in every direction, each one more chaotic than the last. Anxiety weighed heavily on him, but something kept him rooted in place, as if bracing himself for what was to come. His breathing was labored, and the silence of the hallway made each heartbeat pound loudly in his ears. Inside the room, the conversation continued, and Rachel sounded more at ease than he had expected. She laughed again, but it wasn't the laugh he knew, one of comfort or affection. This was different, almost conspiratorial. He tried to push away the thoughts gnawing at him, but the next words he heard hit him like a blow to the stomach. "No, he never gets home at this hour. It's fine." Every word felt like a dark puzzle piece falling into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't avoid. Mike felt anger mix with sadness, creating an overwhelming and confusing sensation. He closed his eyes for a moment, searching for clarity amidst the turmoil in his mind. Am I overreacting? He wondered, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe this is nothing, maybe, but her words kept replaying in his mind, refusing to grant him relief. He knew this wasn't paranoia. The situation was too strange to be a coincidence. Determined, Mike took a step forward, the creak of the floorboard sounding as loud as thunder. He froze, waiting for a reaction, but Rachel didn't notice. She was distracted, engrossed in the conversation, her words flowing like a current he could barely follow. You're overthinking. He doesn't suspect a thing. That sentence made Mike's blood run cold. Suspect what? He thought. What is she talking about? It was as if the ground beneath his feet had vanished, and he was on the brink of falling into an abyss he never knew existed. The anger surged within him, but something stronger held him back, the need to know the whole truth before confronting her. Time seemed to crawl as he stood there, catching snippets of the conversation, trying to piece it together. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed increasingly comfortable. There was something in her tone that disturbed him deeply, a confidence that he would never find out what was going on. Mike clenched his fists, feeling the tension rise through his arms. He wanted to burst through the door at that very moment, but he knew he needed more. The last thing he wanted was to explode without being absolutely certain of what he was facing. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the feeling of betrayal consumed him with every passing second. From the other side of the door, Rachel laughed again. Yes, tomorrow is perfect. Same time works for me. That sentence was the final straw. Mike felt as though the air had been knocked out of his lungs. There was no room for doubt or hesitation anymore. Without thinking, he pushed the door open with force. The sound of the door slamming against the wall made Rachel jump, her phone falling to the floor. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw Mike standing there, his expression a mix of disbelief and pain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the vibrating phone on the floor. The message on the screen shone like a silent accusation, tomorrow, same time? The silence that followed felt endless. Mike stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Rachel, who was as still as a statue. The surprise on her face quickly turned to panic, her hands trembling as she tried to reach for the phone still buzzing on the floor. But Mike was faster. He stepped forward, picked up the device, and held it firmly, as though it was his only anchor to the truth he now had to face. Rachel took a step back, her voice shaking as she tried to fill the suffocating space between them. Mike, it's not what you think. I can explain, she said, but the hesitation in her tone betrayed her. Mike didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the phone screen, on the message that screamed the answers he didn't want to know. Tomorrow, same time. Each word felt like a dagger to his chest. He raised his eyes, his expression filled with pain but also with a controlled anger that gave weight to his words. Then tell me, Rachel, what exactly am I thinking? Because right now, none of this makes sense to me. Rachel swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with tears she tried to hold back but couldn't. She knew she was cornered, and any attempt to deny it would be futile. Instead, she covered her face with her hands, sobbing softly. I was just talking to someone, she began, her words coming out in disjointed fragments. It's just my personal trainer. We met a few times, but that's all, Mike. I swear. Her explanation sounded like a desperate attempt to downplay what he already knew. Mike felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to believe her, wanted so badly for this to be a misunderstanding, but the pieces of the conversation he had overheard left no room for doubt. Talking, he said, his voice firm but emotional. Rachel, I heard you. I heard you say I never suspect anything. That I never come home at this hour. Do you think that sounds like just talking? Rachel tried to move closer to him, but Mike stepped back, raising a hand as if constructing an invisible barrier between them. He didn't want her to touch him, not while the crushing sense of betrayal still weighed heavily on him. Please, Mike. I made a mistake. But it's not what you think. Nothing happened, she pleaded, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that Mike couldn't ignore. He held the phone up in front of her face, the screen still displaying the message. His eyes locked onto hers, searching for something, maybe regret, maybe a spark of truth, that might convince him not to walk away. Tomorrow, same time, he repeated slowly, almost in a whisper. Does that sound like nothing to you? Rachel broke down. Tears now flowed freely as she sank onto the bed, covering her face with her hands. I don't know why I did it. It was just talking, attention, something I felt I was missing, but I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted it to go any further. Her words cut deep. Mike felt the weight of her revelation settle heavily on his shoulders, crushing him. He wanted to scream, wanted to ask why he hadn't been enough for her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he took a step back, the phone still in his hand, as he looked at Rachel like she was a stranger. You didn't want to hurt me, he repeated, his voice low, almost a whisper. Rachel, you've destroyed everything. Everything we had. She looked up, her eyes swollen with tears, but before she could say anything, he turned away. Mike felt as though the ground was disappearing beneath him, but he knew he couldn't stay in that room a second longer. He left without looking back, the phone still buzzing in his hand, a constant reminder of what he had just lost. Mike walked down the stairs with firm steps, but his heart felt like it was stumbling with every beat. Everything around him, the objects, the corners of the house he shared with Rachel, now seemed like cruel reminders of what they had and what he felt he was losing at that moment. He still held the phone, not knowing why he couldn't let it go. Maybe because it now symbolized the truth he didn't want to face but had no choice but to accept. Reaching the living room, he stopped by the table where he had left the bouquet of white lilies. They were still there, so fresh, so pure, so disconnected from the reality that now consumed him. He looked at the flowers for a moment, and the irony of the situation hit him hard. The intention behind them now seemed naive, out of place amidst the pain that filled him. He ran a hand over his face, trying to clear his thoughts, but everything around him seemed to spin. Rachel's muffled sobs from upstairs echoed in the house, a constant reminder of what he had just witnessed. The phone vibrated again in his hand, pulling him out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen, and a mix of anger and curiosity overwhelmed him. This time, it was a different message. It didn't have the same casual tone he had read earlier. Are you okay? Did he suspect anything? The message read. Mike's breathing quickened, and heat surged through his body like a wave. The confirmation was there. It wasn't just innocent chatting, it wasn't just a distraction. It was something planned, something kept hidden. He knew he should drop the phone, should just walk away, but he couldn't resist. A mix of a need for understanding and a desire for answers drove him to open the previous messages. As he read, the weight of the betrayal grew heavier. The exchanges were filled with insinuations and subtle planning, things Rachel had never shared with him. Pieces of a secret world she had built away from his sight. Each message felt like it tore away a piece of his trust, leaving him emptier each time. He read until he couldn't anymore. Not because he had reached the end, but because he felt that if he continued, something inside him would break irreparably. He closed his eyes and let out a heavy sigh, trying to decide what to do next. He couldn't go back up there to confront her again. What more was there to say? Her words had already been lost in the void between them. Mike placed the phone on the table next to the flowers, as if leaving behind the symbol of everything he had uncovered. But before he could take the next step, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Rachel was there, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red but filled with an expression that mixed desperation and hope. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mike raised his hand, signaling for silence. "No. Not now." His voice was low but firm, each word carrying a weight he could no longer bear. Rachel shook her head, struggling to hold back more tears. "Mike, please. I know I made a mistake, but, please listen to me. I don't want to lose you." He looked at her, and for a brief moment, he almost gave in. There was so much love mixed with the pain he felt, so much of their history still alive in his heart. But then, the image of the message flashing on the phone returned to his mind, along with the certainty that something had changed forever. He stepped back, breaking the physical contact between them, and Rachel seemed to shrink under the weight of his rejection. "Rachel, I don't know what you expect me to say. You've destroyed something I never thought could be broken." He paused, looking at her, searching for any sign that she understood the depth of the damage. "I just need time. Space to breathe. Because right now, all I see is this. You and this." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed his car keys from the entryway table and walked out the door. The cool night air enveloped him but brought no relief. He got into the car but didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, trying to find some sense amid the chaos of his night. The silence in the car was almost comforting, but he knew the quiet outside couldn't drown out the storm raging inside him. Mike sat in the car, the sound of the keys dangling against the dashboard swaying slightly with his breathing. The silence outside was nearly absolute, broken only by the occasional wind rustling through the trees on the street. He stared at the steering wheel, at the distorted reflection of his trembling hands in the leather's sheen. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there since leaving the house. It could have been minutes or hours, time seemed meaningless at that point. His mind spun, replaying every moment of the night. The message, Rachel's words, the desperation in her face. He tried, somehow, to rearrange it all into something that made sense, but it was like trying to piece together a puzzle with mismatched parts. He thought he knew Rachel, or at least he had known her until tonight. But now, as he revisited the past few months, the memories took on a different tone. Small gestures, trivial excuses, quickly deleted messages on her phone. Things that once seemed insignificant now stood out as signs of something larger he had overlooked. He closed his eyes, gripping the wheel tightly, trying to push away those images. But even in the darkness of his mind, the message on the phone burned like an invisible scar. He wondered how it had come to this. Was there something he could have done? Had he been neglectful, distracted, or simply not enough? These questions circled in his mind, each one more cruel than the last. And deep down, he knew he wouldn't find the answers now. A notification sound from his own phone pulled him out of his thoughts. He picked it up hesitantly, almost afraid of what it might be. It was a message from a close friend, Mark, someone who had always been like a brother to him. "Hey, are you okay? You seemed off at work today." Mike stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a lump tighten in his throat. Mark was the one person he felt could understand, but how could he explain something he himself still couldn't comprehend? He placed the phone back on the seat beside him, deciding now wasn't the time to respond. He knew he couldn't sit there forever. What he truly needed was a space free of the night's memories or Rachel's lingering presence. So, without thinking too much, he started the car and began driving. He didn't have a destination, he just drove, guided by a need for movement, to escape something that seemed to relentlessly chase his mind. The streets were deserted, lit by dim streetlights casting distorted shadows on the pavement. He passed familiar places that once brought comfort, the cafe where he and Rachel used to have breakfast on Saturdays, the park where he'd planned to propose but got too nervous and ended up doing it in the car. Now, each spot felt loaded with painful irony, as if the universe were mocking him. Eventually, he found himself parked in front of a closed gym. The glass facade reflected the streetlights, and through the darkness, he could see the neatly arranged equipment, the stationary treadmills, the orderly weights. The sight was ordinary but carried significance. It was there that Rachel had first mentioned her personal trainer. Mike had never paid attention. He trusted her, he always had. He thought about going in, maybe confronting whoever the man was. But the idea felt absurd and desperate. What would he gain from it? More empty words? More excuses that would only deepen the pain? He shook his head, muttering to himself, "This won't change anything." The exhaustion finally caught up to him. He felt the weight of the night pressing down on his shoulders, consuming whatever energy he had left. He was tired, not just physically but emotionally, mentally. Yet he knew this was only the first of many nights he would have to face the reality of what had happened. Resting his head against the steering wheel, he allowed himself, for the first time, to feel the full depth of the emptiness inside him. Mike stayed with his forehead against the steering wheel. The emotional exhaustion seemed to drain whatever strength he had left. The memories, the thoughts, and the doubts whirled in his mind like an uncontrollable storm, and he realized he needed a starting point, something to help him begin to reorganize his life after that night. Finally, he lifted his head and looked up at the sky through the windshield. The stars were scattered, shining with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos within him. For a moment, he wondered how the world could appear so peaceful while his life seemed to be falling apart. He took a deep breath, trying to draw some of that serenity into himself. Suddenly, something within him began to shift. Maybe it was the exhaustion reaching a critical point, or maybe it was the instinct for emotional survival. But he felt a spark of clarity amidst the turmoil. He realized that no matter how crushing Rachel's betrayal was, he still had control over one thing: how he chose to respond from that moment forward. The pain was there, raw and overwhelming, but he knew he didn't want to be defined by it. He wanted something more for himself, something beyond the suffering. Mike started driving again, this time with more purpose. He decided he needed a place where he could think, where he could feel everything he needed to without interruption. He arrived at a park he used to visit in the early years of his marriage. It was late, and the place was deserted. He parked the car and got out, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. He walked to a bench near a small lake, where the water reflected the starlight. There, sitting under the open sky, he finally allowed the tears to fall freely. As painful as it was, he knew he needed to let it out. He cried for everything, for the betrayal, the loss of trust, the years he had invested in a marriage that now felt so fragile. But as the tears fell, he felt something else. A weight began to lift, as though each tear carried away a fragment of the pain. He knew it wouldn't be a quick or easy process, but there, on that lonely bench, he took the first step toward healing. While sitting there, surrounded by the night's silence, he began to reflect on what he truly wanted for his future. He knew he couldn't go back in time or undo what Rachel had done. But he also knew he didn't have to carry that burden alone. He thought of Mark, of his earlier message, and realized it might be time to open up to someone. Mark was more than a friend, he was someone Mike knew he could trust. He picked up his phone and typed a short message: "You were right. I'm not okay. Can we talk?" He sent it before he could hesitate, and the simple act of pressing send felt like a release. He didn't know what to expect from the conversation, but he knew he had to start rebuilding himself, even if it was one small step at a time. As he waited for a reply, he looked out at the lake and began to remember who he was before Rachel, before the marriage. He thought about the dreams he had, the things he loved to do but had set aside over the years. There was a life there, one he could reclaim, or even reinvent. For the first time that night, he felt something close to hope. It wasn't big or strong, but it was there, a spark ready to grow. The phone vibrated in his hand, and a message from Mark appeared: "Of course. I'm here for you. Do you want to talk now or tomorrow?" Mike smiled faintly, feeling a little less alone. He replied, "Tomorrow, thanks. I need to sort out my thoughts." As he put the phone away, he realized that this decision, small as it was a step toward who he wanted to be, someone who, despite the pain, chose to move forward. That night, Mike returned to the car and drove, not to the house he shared with Rachel but to his parents' home, where he knew he would find comfort. He knew the journey ahead would be long, filled with ups and downs, but for the first time since opening that door and watching his world collapse, he felt he could find himself again. The betrayal would not be the end of his story but the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would choose his own path without looking back. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.
Welcome back to the Cheating Tales Lab. First of all, a huge thank you for helping us reach 5,000 subscribers. Thank you all for your amazing support. To celebrate, we're launching our second channel, Infidelity Tales Lab, where you'll get one-day early access to all our stories plus exclusive, original cheating wife stories you won't find anywhere else. You can subscribe now by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment, or simply search for Infidelity Tales Lab on YouTube. Don't miss out, subscribe and listen to exclusive stories. You won't regret subscribing. Now let's begin the story. The setting sun painted golden streaks across the polished marble floors of the Sullivan Mansion's modernist living room. Lawrence Sullivan stood motionless, his tall frame reflected in the same mirror where his wife Patricia was adjusting her dress. The red fabric clung to her curves like a second skin, the neckline plunging well below what any respectable corporate wife would wear to a merger announcement. Lawrence observed her with the same analytical precision that had made him one of Silicon Valley's most formidable CEOs. At 45, he still cut an imposing figure in his tailored charcoal suit. Years of martial arts training and disciplined workout routines had kept him fit, while building Sullivan Technologies into a cybersecurity empire had honed his mind into a weapon sharper than any blade. "You know how important tonight is," he said, his deep voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. "The merger announcement requires a certain level of professionalism. That dress sends the wrong message." Patricia's fingers lingered on the fabric, smoothing it over her hips with deliberate slowness. "It's always about your image, isn't it, Lawrence?" She reached for her lipstick, applying another layer of crimson. "God forbid I want to feel beautiful for once. Not everything revolves around Sullivan Technologies." The words hung in the air like poison gas, triggering something in Lawrence's mind. As CEO of the world's leading cybersecurity firm, he'd built his career on detecting patterns. The smallest anomaly could indicate a system breach. Lately, the anomalies in his personal life had been accumulating, unexplained absences that stretched beyond their stated duration. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered a room. Personal training sessions that always seemed to run late. Credit card charges from hotels in the city where they lived. New jewelry she claimed to have had for years. Instead of responding to her barb, Lawrence checked his phone. A message from Chris Berger, his head of security, confirmed what he needed to know. His private team was in position. He'd hired Chris 8 years ago, recognizing in the former Special Forces operator the same ruthless efficiency he valued in himself. Where Lawrence was subtle steel, Chris was raw iron. Effective, unyielding, and absolutely loyal. "I need to handle some things at the office before the gala," Lawrence said, adjusting his platinum cufflinks, a 5th anniversary gift from Patricia that now felt like a marker of mockery. "I'll meet you there." Patricia barely acknowledged him, too busy with her preparation. Her indifference was new, or perhaps he was only now allowing himself to see it. As he left the room, he activated a secure line to Chris. "Begin Protocol 7, he ordered. "Full surveillance, no limitations. I want eyes and ears on everything, sir." Chris's voice held a note of concern. "That level of monitoring, it's unprecedented. The resources require. Do it. You have complete authorization." "And Chris? This stays between us." Lawrence descended the curved staircase of his home, past the family portraits that now seemed like elaborate props in a staged play. He'd built this life on a foundation of integrity and family values. Sullivan Technologies wasn't just another tech company. It was a legacy he'd intended to pass down to his children. Now, watching his wife prepare for what she thought was a simple corporate gala, he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. His Tesla waited in the circular driveway, its black surface reflecting the sunset like obsidian. As he slid behind the wheel, another message from Chris lit up his secure phone. Initial surveillance active. You need to see this. The Sullivan Technologies corporate headquarters dominated the San Francisco skyline, its glass and steel structure a testament to Lawrence's vision. But tonight, he bypassed the executive floor for a secure room 3 levels below ground. Here, surrounded by monitors displaying multiple camera feeds, Lawrence watched his wife's calculated performance at the gala. Patricia had made her entrance 20 minutes ago, the red dress drawing exactly the kind of attention she'd intended. She'd immediately gravitated toward Herman Black, Lawrence's supposed best friend and COO. Through high-resolution cameras and directional microphones, Lawrence observed their interaction with growing coldness. "Come here often, stranger?" Patricia's voice came through crisp and clear as she sidled up to Herman at the bar. Her hand brushed his arm in a gesture too familiar for comfort. Herman's fingers traced her waist, hidden from the crowd by the bar's position. "You're playing a dangerous game tonight, Pat. That dress." "Lawrence still suspects nothing," she whispered, leaning close enough that her lips nearly brushed Herman's ear. "The shell companies are in place. Once the merger goes through next week, everything changes. The accounts are ready?" Herman's voice held equal measures of lust and greed. "Everything's prepared. Sandy confirmed the last transfers yesterday. It's perfect." Lawrence is so busy protecting the company from external threats, he never thought to look inside his own home. Lawrence's fingers tightened on his desk as Chris entered with a tablet. The former operator's face was grim. "Sir, our team has uncovered something bigger than an affair. You need to see this." The evidence unfolded across multiple screens, each revelation more damaging than the last. The merger with Jared Norton's tech firm wasn't an expansion opportunity. It was an elaborate trap designed to hollow out Sullivan Technologies from the inside. Patricia wasn't just sleeping with Herman. She was the central figure in a conspiracy that included Norton, Herman, and even Lawrence's own brother, Guillermo. "There's more," Chris said, pulling up another set of files. "Your daughter's recent behavioral issues? The declining grades, the rebellion, the sudden hostility toward you? We've found evidence that Mrs. Sullivan has been deliberately sabotaging your relationship with both children." Surveillance footage played across the screens. Patricia in careful conversation with Mandy's teachers, planting seeds of doubt about Lawrence's commitment to his family. Text messages showed her manipulating situations, staging incidents designed to drive wedges between father and children. She'd even gone as far as intercepting and altering messages between Lawrence and his son Bill at college. "Show me everything," Lawrence commanded, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded hurricanes. "Every detail, every player, every angle." For the next hour, they pieced together a conspiracy that stretched back years. Patricia hadn't just betrayed their marriage. She'd orchestrated a complete infiltration of his life. The cameras continued to show the gala, where she laughed and danced, celebrating what she thought was her imminent victory. The night stretched into early morning as Lawrence dove deeper into encrypted servers and hidden accounts. Each discovery was another betrayal crystallized in data, another crack in the foundation of trust he'd built his life upon. His brother Guillermo had been running ghost projects through the R&D department, siphoning millions through fake research initiatives. The money trail led to offshore accounts, carefully hidden but not invisible to someone with Lawrence's resources. Herman's betrayal went beyond the affair. He'd been selling company secrets to competitors, using the profits to fund a lavish lifestyle that included regular trips with Patricia to private villas in the Mediterranean. Their affair hadn't been a recent development. Bank records showed shared accounts dating back 3 years. Patricia's role was perhaps the most insidious. She'd methodically gathered compromising information on board members, building a blackmail portfolio that would have given her control of the company after Lawrence's planned ouster. She'd used her position as his wife to access information, to build relationships, to plant seeds of doubt about his leadership. But Sandy, his sister-in-law, had been the biggest surprise. She'd constructed an entire shadow company built on stolen Sullivan Technologies patents, preparing to launch competing products the moment Lawrence was removed from power. "Sir," Chris said, returning with another set of files. "We've confirmed the timing. The dress tonight? It wasn't just inappropriate. They're celebrating. The merger announcement was supposed to be the beginning of your end. They think they've won." Lawrence stood, walking to the window that overlooked the sleeping city. In the reflection, he could see the monitors behind him, Patricia and Herman sharing another intimate moment, his brother glad-handing investors, Sandy watching it all with satisfied eyes. "Activate Protocol Zero," he said, his voice carrying absolute finality. Chris didn't bother hiding his concern. "Sir, Protocol Zero. The collateral damage will be extensive. Personal reputations, careers, families. They chose their fate when they targeted my children." Lawrence turned, his face illuminated by the city lights and the glow of monitors. "They didn't just try to steal my company. They tried to steal my legacy. Execute Protocol Zero. Now." Through the cameras, he could still see Patricia laughing with Herman, their hands touching under tables, their confidence complete. They had no idea that Lawrence Sullivan didn't just plan for cyber attacks. He planned for everything. The first phase of Protocol Zero began at midnight. A cascade of encrypted locks on company data, phantom account transfers, and the quiet activation of hidden contract clauses that would trap millions in legal limbo. By the time Patricia danced with Herman to what they thought was their victory song, Lawrence had already seized control of every shell company they'd created. His most trusted assistant, Brooke, worked silently in an adjacent office, gathering evidence and securing his children's futures. Mandy, away at a friend's house, had already been contacted and protected. Bill's college accounts were transferred to secure trusts beyond Patricia's reach. Lawrence watched the final pieces fall into place, remembering Patricia's words from earlier. "Maybe I want to feel beautiful for once." She'd never looked uglier to him than she did now, draped over Herman, plotting his destruction. The red dress that had been meant to mark her triumph would instead become the symbol of her downfall. Dawn approached as Lawrence made his final preparations. While Patricia celebrated her imagined victory, divorce papers were being delivered to their home, along with evidence of her crimes carefully distributed to select board members. Lawrence Sullivan, the man she thought she deceived, would be gone. But Lawrence Sullivan, the man who'd built an empire on seeing the patterns others missed, would be very much alive and very, very angry. The night of the gala wouldn't be remembered as the beginning of Lawrence Sullivan's downfall. Instead, it would mark the start of the most meticulously planned revenge in Silicon Valley history. The gala's music pulsed through the grand ballroom of the St. Regis as Lawrence's plan unfolded with mechanical precision. In the building's secure server room, his team of cybersecurity experts executed complex protocols that would seal the conspirators' fate. Lines of code scrolled across screens as company data underwent military-grade encryption, while carefully crafted algorithms began transferring millions into phantom accounts. Through the surveillance feeds, Lawrence watched Patricia twirl in Herman's arms, her red dress a splash of blood against the white marble floor. Neither of them noticed when their phones briefly lost signal, the moment when their access to the shell company's accounts was permanently severed. "Sir, Phase 1 is complete," reported his lead IT specialist. "All offshore accounts have been redirected. The phantom protocols are active." Lawrence nodded, his face illuminated by the blue glow of monitors. "Trigger the contract clauses." Brooke, his executive assistant of 8 years, worked methodically at her station. She'd been gathering evidence for months, having noticed discrepancies in board meeting minutes and irregular patterns in company communications. Now, she was ensuring every piece of documentation was properly secured and backed up on servers that only Lawrence could access. "Mr. Sullivan," Brooke said, looking up from her screen, "Mandy is secure. The security team confirmed she's chosen to leave with you. She's quite angry about what her mother did." A brief flash of emotion crossed Lawrence's face, the only one he'd shown all night. His daughter had inherited his analytical mind. Once presented with evidence of Patricia's manipulation, the altered text messages, the staged conflicts, the deliberate sabotage of father-daughter events, she made her choice with cold clarity. And Bill? The trust is established and funded. His college accounts are secured. He's protected, sir, though he doesn't know everything yet. We thought it best to wait until after his finals. Lawrence turned to Chris, who stood by the door. Begin phase 2. While Patricia danced and laughed, believing she was celebrating her impending triumph, Lawrence's team executed a series of precisely timed operations. All company data was locked behind new encryption protocols. Millions in assets were legally transferred through predetermined channels. Hidden contract clauses were activated, giving Lawrence control of the shell companies. Emergency board protocols were initiated, temporarily concentrating power in the CEO position. Surveillance data was secured and backed up to multiple secure locations. By midnight, as Patricia sipped champagne with her co-conspirators, Lawrence had effectively seized control of every asset they thought they'd stolen. The irony of their celebration wasn't lost on him. They were toasting their own destruction. The divorce papers are being delivered now, Brooke confirmed. Along with selected evidence packages to specific board members, Lawrence stood, straightening his tie. Distribute the remaining files as planned. It's time. Before dawn broke over San Francisco, Lawrence Sullivan, the man they thought they'd outsmarted, vanished completely. His disappearance was as meticulous as everything else he did. No trace, no trail, no loose ends. Patricia's homecoming would be her first taste of the new reality. She'd find all accounts emptied or frozen. Divorce papers detailing her infidelity and conspiracy. Evidence of her crimes in the hands of key board members. Her access to company resources completely revoked. Her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The first cracks appeared at dawn. Herman Black stood in his private office, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. Every offshore account empty. Years of carefully hidden funds, gone. His phone buzzed constantly with alerts. Access denied, transfer failed, account suspended. What the hell is happening? He barked into his phone. All pretense of smooth sophistication gone. Fix this. But there was nothing to fix. The money hadn't been stolen. It had been legally reclaimed through a web of contracts and clauses so complex that his lawyers were already getting headaches. Across town, Guillermo Sullivan watched federal auditors march into his department. They carried boxes of documents, detailed records of every ghost project, every fraudulent transaction, every fake research initiative he'd used to embezzle millions. His attempt to call his sister-in-law Sandy went straight to voicemail. Sandy had problems of her own. Her parallel company, built on stolen Sullivan Technologies patents, faced not just litigation but complete annihilation. Emergency injunctions had frozen her assets. Cease and desist orders arrived by the dozen. Her technical team reported that critical data was simply gone. But it was Jared Norton who broke first. The veteran tech executive recognized a lost cause when he saw one. He reached out to federal investigators with an offer. Evidence of Patricia's involvement in industrial espionage in exchange for immunity. His betrayal was quick, complete, and self-serving, exactly what Lawrence had predicted. Patricia's fall was particularly spectacular. Her society friends, who'd once competed for her attention, now wouldn't return her calls. Claudia Martinez, Lawrence's corporate counsel and a pillar of San Francisco society, led the social exodus. The same people who'd admired Patricia's red dress at the gala now whispered about her disgrace at charity functions. I don't know what you're talking about, Herman declared publicly when asked about their relationship. Mrs. Sullivan was simply another board member's wife. These accusations are ridiculous. He'd thrown her under the bus so fast it left skid marks. Watching him deny their relationship on live television, Patricia finally understood. She'd been played for a fool, not by Lawrence, but by her own co-conspirators. Time became Lawrence's greatest weapon. While his enemies expected immediate destruction, he delivered something far more devastating. Slow, systematic dismantling of their lives. Like a master chess player, he'd set up moves that would play out over years. Guillermo's downfall came first. Over 18 months, Lawrence's algorithms orchestrated what appeared to be a series of unfortunate market crashes. Each one targeted his brother's remaining investments with surgical precision. By the end of year 2, Guillermo Sullivan, once a millionaire executive, was selling his house to cover basic expenses. It's just bad luck, Guillermo told his wife, staring at another margin call notice. The market's volatile, but it wasn't luck. It was Lawrence, operating through layers of shells and proxies, using his brother's own greed against him. Every time Guillermo thought he'd found a safe investment, invisible hands would shift the market just enough to destroy him. Sandy's destruction took longer, but proved more complete. Her company weathered the first wave of patent lawsuits, but then strange things began happening. Critical servers failed at crucial moments. Potential clients received anonymous tips about security vulnerabilities. Mysterious cyber attacks exposed just enough of her stolen technology to scare away investors. There's nothing linking these incidents, her security team reported. It's like we're cursed. 3 years in, Sandy's company collapsed under the weight of litigation and technical failures. The industry blacklist followed naturally. No one would hire an executive with her record of incompetence. Herman's reputation died by 1,000 cuts. Evidence of his affairs, not just with Patricia, but with numerous others, leaked to the press in a steady drip. Each revelation was more damaging than the last. His attempts to deny them only made him look worse, especially when time-stamped videos proved his lies. "I assure you, these allegations are completely false," he'd say, only to have photos appear the next day showing exactly what he denied. Patricia's attempts to access Lawrence's fortune met with constant failure. Every legal challenge was met with overwhelming evidence of her crimes. Her lawyers kept quitting as new conflicts of interest mysteriously emerged. Her attempts to sell stories to the press backfired when journalists received proof of her lies. But while his enemies floundered, Lawrence rebuilt. Operating under various aliases and through multiple corporations, he constructed a new empire. His children thrived under his guidance. Mandy discovered her talent for cybersecurity, eventually becoming one of the field's rising stars. Bill excelled in corporate law, his understanding of business enhanced by watching his father's strategic brilliance. Both children understood the truth. Their father hadn't run away. He'd removed them from a toxic environment. Lawrence maintained perfect operational security through it all. Not once in 6 years did his enemies discover his location or new identity. He watched them through surveillance networks, monitored their desperate attempts to recover, and methodically closed every door they tried to open. His new corporation grew quietly but steadily, absorbing vulnerable assets from his former enemies' failed ventures. Each acquisition was legal, logical, and completely untraceable to him. He wasn't just destroying their present. He was using their resources to build his future. The conspirators never realized they were watching their own assets being used against them. They were too busy surviving. Guillermo took increasingly desperate consulting jobs. Sandy moved to progressively smaller apartments. Herman found his reputation so toxic that even startups wouldn't touch him. Patricia's attempts to leverage her former social status met with embarrassing failures. Through it all, Lawrence worked with mechanical precision. Each move was calculated, each consequence measured. He didn't act from emotion, revenge, serve cold, required patience and planning. He was building something greater than destruction. A legacy that would prove betrayal never pays. For 6 years, he was a ghost in the machine, an invisible hand of justice. His enemies looked over their shoulders, jumped at shadows, and slowly went mad trying to figure out why everything they touched turned to ash. But Lawrence knew something they didn't. This was just the prelude. The real endgame was still to come. The security cameras caught Patricia's arrival at 9:47 a.m. 6 years had not been kind to her. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by off-the-rack wear that tried too hard to look expensive. Her once perfect hair showed streaks of gray, and her makeup couldn't quite hide the lines of bitterness etched into her face. She clutched the hand of a small boy, 5 years old, dark-haired, with Herman's distinctive nose. The child looked around with nervous curiosity as Patricia approached the front desk of the towering glass building that housed Nova Technologies, Lawrence's new empire built from the ashes of his enemies' ambitions. "I need to see Lawrence Sullivan," Patricia announced, her voice carrying the same entitled tone she'd used at the gala 6 years ago. "Tell him his wife is here." The receptionist, already briefed for this moment, replied with practiced neutrality. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There's no Lawrence Sullivan here." "Ex-wife," Patricia corrected, fumbling in her purse. "And I know he's here. This building, this company. It's all his. The boy. He needs to meet his father. Security cameras tracked their movement through the lobby. In his office 60 floors above, Lawrence watched the scene unfold on his monitors. DNA test results were already open on his tablet. Tests he'd arranged months ago through his surveillance network. The boy's genetic profile was displayed next to Herman's, a 99.9% match. She's getting desperate, Chris observed from his position by the door. Trying to claim paternity after 6 years? Lawrence's lips curved slightly. Herman knows about the boy. He abandoned them both 3 years ago. My sources confirmed he's been dodging child support through shell companies. The trust you set up for the kid has been covering their basic needs, Chris added. Though Patricia's been neglecting him despite the support. We have documentation of missed doctor's appointments, unexplained absences from school. Lawrence nodded. Everything was proceeding exactly as he'd predicted. Patricia's attempt to leverage a non-existent paternity claim would become yet another weapon in his arsenal. Sir, his assistant's voice came through the intercom. Mrs. Black is becoming insistent. Lawrence pressed a button, and security footage showed Patricia growing increasingly agitated in the lobby. You tell Lawrence that Thomas is his son, she demanded, her voice rising. We were together that last night before he disappeared. He has responsibilities. The boy, Thomas, shrank away from his mother's outburst, displaying a practiced familiarity with her episodes. Lawrence's surveillance had documented dozens of similar scenes. Patricia's public meltdowns, her neglect of the child, her attempts to use him as leverage against both Herman and Lawrence. Show them up, Lawrence commanded. It's time to end this particular charade. 10 minutes later, Patricia burst into his office, dragging Thomas behind her. She froze at the sight of Lawrence behind his desk, looking barely a day older than when he'd vanished. Success had preserved him, while failure had ravaged her. You've been here all along, she whispered. Right under our noses. Sit down, Patricia, Lawrence said calmly. We need to discuss Thomas's future. Specifically, why you've been neglecting the child support payments Herman's sister Ronnie sends for him. Patricia's face went white. How did you? I've been watching. I've watched you waste the support money on failed get-rich-quick schemes. I've documented every missed parent-teacher conference, every skipped medical checkup, every time you left him alone while you chased dead-end leads trying to find my fortune. He turned his tablet around, showing her the DNA results. Thomas isn't mine, Patricia. But unlike his actual father, I've been ensuring he has food, shelter, and education through the trust one established. The same trust you've been misappropriating. You can't prove. I can prove everything. Lawrence pressed a button, and screens around the office lit up with surveillance footage, financial records, and medical reports. The question is, what happens next? Thomas, forgotten by his mother in her shock, had gravitated toward a corner of the office where a familiar red dress hung in a frame. He stared at it with innocent curiosity while his mother's last desperate gambit crumbled around him. 1 week later, 5 separate town cars arrived at Nova Technologies headquarters. Each carried a passenger who'd received an invitation they couldn't refuse. Herman Black emerged first, his designer suit a cheap knockoff of his former wardrobe. Bankruptcy had left him desperate enough to walk into what he suspected was a trap. Guillermo Sullivan followed, wearing the uniform of the security company where he now worked as a middle manager. 6 years of orchestrated financial disasters had stripped him of everything except his bitter resentment. Sandy stepped out next, clutching a briefcase containing legal papers about her pending criminal charges. Her once confident stride had been replaced by nervous glances over her shoulder. Jared Norton arrived fourth, his immunity deal crumbling under the weight of new evidence. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man watching his carefully constructed lies unravel. Patricia entered last, still reeling from her failed paternity gambit. She'd received custody papers that morning. Herman's sister Ronnie was suing for custody of Thomas, backed by extensive evidence of neglect. The lobby directory listed their destination as Conference Room A, Special Board Meeting. None of them noticed that each guard, each receptionist, each person they passed had been specifically chosen for this day. Lawrence watched their approach on his monitors. Beside him stood his inner circle, each prepared for their role. Mandy, now 24, had grown into a formidable cybersecurity expert. Her tablets displayed years of surveillance data on her mother's activities. Bill, fresh from law school, carried files documenting every aspect of Guillermo's crimes. His uncle's betrayal had shaped his understanding of corporate law. Brooke, promoted to COO, held evidence of Sandy's corporate espionage, every stolen patent, every secret deal, every hidden transaction. Chris maintained his position by the door, ready to present proof of Herman's multiple betrayals. Claudia Martinez, corporate counsel extraordinaire, stood ready with documentation of their collective conspiracy. The conspirators entered the conference room separately, each trying to avoid eye contact with the others. The room's design was deliberate. A long table with high-backed chairs facing a massive screen, currently dark. "Please, be seated," a familiar voice commanded from hidden speakers. The screen lit up, showing Lawrence in his office. But before anyone could react, the conference room's doors opened. Lawrence walked in. The real Lawrence. The screen had been a misdirection, a final reminder of how easily they'd been manipulated. 6 years, he said, taking his place at the head of the table. 6 years of watching you destroy yourselves with your own greed and stupidity. You bastard. Herman started to rise. But Chris's hand on his shoulder forced him back down. Interesting choice of words, Herman, Lawrence replied. Especially given how you abandoned your own son. Patricia flinched. Guillermo's security guard uniform suddenly felt too tight. Sandy's fingers trembled on her briefcase. Today isn't about revenge, Lawrence continued. It's about justice, about consequences, about truth. He nodded to his team. Mandy stepped forward first, her tablet projecting onto the screen. Mother, would you like to explain these recordings? The ones showing how you deliberately sabotaged my relationship with Dad. Patricia's face drained of color as her own voice filled the room, carefully orchestrating conflicts, manipulating events, poisoning her children against their father. Bill followed with his presentation. Uncle Guillermo, the federal authorities are very interested in these transaction records. But they're especially interested in what you did with the money. One by one, they presented their evidence. Brooke exposed Sandy's corporate espionage, including emails proving she'd stolen patents before they were even filed. Chris detailed Herman's betrayals, complete with surveillance footage of meetings with competitors. Claudia presented proof of their collective conspiracy, revealing how each person's actions connected to create a complete picture of betrayal. But it was Lawrence's final revelation that shattered their last hopes. Your immunity deal, Jared, he said, turning to Norton. Did you really think I wouldn't find the evidence you held back? The real records of your involvement? Norton's face went ashen. His immunity deal had been based on full disclosure. The evidence Lawrence now displayed proved he'd lied to federal investigators. The justice Lawrence had orchestrated fell like dominoes, each piece triggering the next with mechanical precision. Herman was the first to break. When faced with Chris's evidence of his corporate fraud, not just the affair with Patricia, but years of selling company secrets, his facade crumbled. I want to make a deal, he blurted out, earning disgusted looks from his co-conspirators. The time for deals is over, Lawrence replied. Federal agents are already processing your involvement in industrial espionage. The evidence has been verified by 3 independent sources. Guillermo tried a different approach. Brother, please, you lost the right to call me brother when you chose to steal from your own family. Lawrence cut him off. However, the DA is willing to discuss a plea deal. In exchange for your complete testimony, Guillermo's shoulders slumped. The security guard uniform he wore suddenly felt like a preview of his future prison attire. Within an hour, he'd signed a full confession, detailing every ghost project, every stolen dollar. Sandy's collapse was more spectacular. As Brooke methodically presented evidence of her corporate espionage, her industry contacts were simultaneously receiving detailed documentation of her crimes. By sunset, she'd be blacklisted from every major tech company in the country. You can't do this, she whispered. But her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. I already have, Lawrence replied. Your new company's assets are being seized as we speak. The patents you stole are being returned to their rightful owner. Jared Norton's immunity deal crumbled under the weight of newly revealed evidence. His attempted betrayal of his co-conspirators had backfired spectacularly. Lawrence had known about his hidden records all along, waiting for the perfect moment to expose them. The federal prosecutors are particularly interested in the evidence you conveniently forgot to mention, Lawrence informed him. Immunity deals require full disclosure, Jared. You should have read the fine print. But it was Patricia's fate that proved most fitting. As the others faced their legal consequences, she watched her last claims to Lawrence's fortune evaporate. Every attempt she'd made to access his wealth over the past 6 years was exposed as the desperate grasping it had been. The boy, she tried one last time. Thomas needs stability, Lawrence interrupted. Which is why I'm supporting Ronnie's custody petition. Herman's sister has proven to be the only adult in his life who truly cares for his welfare. The resolution moved with swift efficiency. Herman was led away by federal agents, his corporate fraud charges carrying a minimum 10-year sentence. Guillermo signed his plea deal, accepting a lesser sentence in exchange for his testimony. Sandy watched helplessly as her industry contacts abandoned her, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. Jared's immunity deal was officially revoked, multiple indictments following within hours. Patricia lost her final appeal for Lawrence's assets, her claims dismissed with prejudice. But Lawrence wasn't finished. As his enemies faced their fates, he turned his attention to the innocent caught in their web. Thomas, Herman's abandoned son, was placed in Ronnie's custody. Lawrence ensured the boy would have everything he needed: education, support, and most importantly, stability. The trust he'd established would guarantee Thomas never suffered for his parents' sins. Your actions forced me to destroy your world, Lawrence told the assembled conspirators. But unlike you, I protect the innocent. Thomas will have every opportunity you tried to steal from my own children. As security led them away, Lawrence stood at his office window, watching the sun set over his rebuilt empire. Behind him hung the red dress that had started it all, no longer a symbol of betrayal, but a reminder of justice served. 1 year later, Lawrence sat in that same office, surveying what his revenge had built. The company had grown stronger than ever. Mandy headed the cybersecurity division, her insight shaped by watching her father's strategic brilliance. Bill ran the legal department, his understanding of corporate law deepened by documenting his uncle's crimes. Brooke served as COO, her loyalty rewarded with the position she'd earned. Chris directed global security operations, his protectiveness extending to the entire Sullivan empire. Claudia's position as chief corporate counsel was untouchable, her handling of the conspirators' downfall legendary in legal circles. Meanwhile, the conspirators lived with their consequences. Herman served his time in federal prison, his corporate fraud conviction ensuring he'd never work in business again. His attempts to appeal fell flat, each rejection citing the overwhelming evidence against him. Guillermo worked night shifts as a security guard, his plea deal leaving him just enough freedom to survive but not enough to thrive. His former wealth and status existed only in his bitter memories. Sandy lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, blacklisted from the corporate world she'd once navigated so confidently. Her attempts to rebuild her reputation met with closed doors and turned backs. Jared faced multiple indictments, his legal troubles mounting as more evidence of his deception came to light. His immunity deal's collapse had triggered a domino effect of legal consequences. Patricia, her society status destroyed, worked as a retail clerk in a mall department store. Her former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Her attempts to rebuild her social standing failed repeatedly, her name now synonymous with betrayal in San Francisco society. The red dress hung in Lawrence's office, framed behind bulletproof glass, a reminder that justice, properly served, required not just vengeance but wisdom. His new wife, Amanda Troy, who had helped expose the conspiracy's financial threads, understood its significance. Their blended family, including Thomas whom Lawrence mentored from a careful distance, represented his true victory. Revenge, Lawrence had learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about protecting the innocent and ensuring karma found its true targets. As he watched his family and loyal friends celebrating the company's anniversary, he understood that the best revenge wasn't just destroying his enemies. It was building something stronger from the ashes of their betrayal. The power of patient, calculated response to betrayal had proven absolute. Every character's fate felt earned, every resolution complete, every loyalty rewarded. Justice, served cold but served completely, had prevailed. Epilogue. Patricia Black, formerly Sullivan, stared at her reflection in the employee bathroom mirror of Carson's department store. At 52, the careful maintenance of her appearance had become an obsession, a desperate attempt to cling to her former glory. The employee discount barely covered her basic cosmetics, and her monthly paycheck as a sales clerk couldn't sustain even a fraction of her former lifestyle. Her studio apartment, a far cry from the Sullivan mansion, sat above a Chinese restaurant in a forgotten corner of San Francisco. The constant smell of cooking oil served as a daily reminder of her fall. Her wedding rings, both from Lawrence and her brief, disastrous marriage to Herman, had been sold years ago to cover legal fees. Every attempt to rebuild her social standing had failed spectacularly. 3 charity organizations had publicly rejected her volunteer applications. Former friends blocked her calls and social media accounts. Country clubs cited membership restrictions when she attempted to join. Even her mother's bridge club had quietly asked her not to attend their annual fundraiser. Her relationship with Thomas, now 11, existed solely through court-mandated supervised visits twice a month. Ronnie, Herman's sister, had won full custody 5 years ago, backed by Lawrence's meticulous documentation of Patricia's neglect. The trust Lawrence had established ensured Thomas attended the best schools and had every opportunities Patricia could no longer pretend to provide. Herman Black's fate proved equally fitting. Federal prison Camp Montgomery had stripped away his arrogance along with his freedom. His 7-year sentence, reduced from 10 for cooperation, offered ample time to reflect on his choices. His cellmate, ironically, was a former hedge fund manager who'd lost everything to one of Lawrence's market corrections. The consequences of their betrayal continued to unfold. Patricia's attempts to write a tell-all book were shut down by ironclad NDAs. Herman's appeals were rejected with increasing finality. Their joint assets had been seized and liquidated. Their reputations were so thoroughly destroyed that even their failures made no news. Lawrence's new headquarters dominated the San Francisco skyline, a testament to patient revenge and calculated reconstruction. The Nova Technologies logo gleamed against the morning sun, while inside, the fruits of loyalty flourished. Mandy Sullivan, now strategic director of cybersecurity, had transformed her father's security protocols into an industry standard. Her department's innovations, born from watching Lawrence's methodical dismantling of his enemies, regularly set new benchmarks in digital protection. At 29, industry publications already called her the next generation of security evolution. Bill Sullivan's legal department had become legendary for its precision. His understanding of corporate law, shaped by documenting his uncle's downfall, made him uniquely qualified to protect the company's interests. His recent marriage to the daughter of a Supreme Court justice had added another layer of influence to the Sullivan legacy. Brooks' promotion to COO proved Lawrence's eye for talent. Her management style, learned from years of watching him operate, combined efficiency with strategic insight. The board's unanimous support of her leadership reflected the company's strongest quarter in history. Chris expanded global security into an independent subsidiary, providing specialized services to select clients. His loyalty to Lawrence had been rewarded with partial ownership of the new venture, though he still personally oversaw the Sullivan family's security. Claudia Martinez's position as chief corporate counsel came with a corner office and a view of the Bay. Her handling of the conspirators' downfall had become a case study at leading law schools, though the full details remained sealed. Lawrence's marriage to Amanda Troy brought more than personal happiness. It united 2 powerful families with complementary strengths. Her financial expertise had helped trace the conspiracy's money trails, and her understanding of loss, having lost her first husband to the conspirators' machinations, gave her unique insight into Lawrence's motivations. Their blended family thrived. Amanda's teenage daughters excelled under Mandy's mentorship. Thomas, though not officially part of the family, received carefully structured guidance. The Sullivan name once again represented integrity and innovation. Their regular family dinners became a symbol of victory over betrayal. The company's success exceeded even Lawrence's calculations. Nova Technologies absorbed key markets from competitors, Strategic acquisitions strengthened their global position, innovation patents secured their technological lead, stock values tripled under the new leadership. Lawrence maintained discreet surveillance on his former enemies, not from fear or obsession, but as a matter of principle. Their continuing struggles served as data points in his understanding of justice. Patricia's attempts at redemption, failed interviews for better positions, rejected applications for loans, unsuccessful efforts to contact Thomas outside approved visits, declined submissions to society magazines about her psi. Herman's prison existence, declined requests for parole, failed attempts to publish business insights, rejected appeals for sentence reduction, growing isolation as former contacts abandoned him. The red dress, still framed in Lawrence's office, had acquired almost mythical status among employees. New hires learned quickly not to ask about it directly, but its story, carefully curated versions of it, circulated as a warning about betrayal and a testament to loyalty. Lawrence's revenge hadn't just destroyed his enemies. It had built something greater, a corporate culture that valued loyalty above all, a family strengthened by overcoming betrayal, a legacy secured for generations, a reputation for patient, absolute justice. Thomas, unaware of his full connection to events, was thriving under Ronnie's care. The trust Lawrence established ensured he would have every opportunity to build his own legacy, untainted by his parents' choices. In the end, Lawrence's patient vengeance had transformed betrayal into foundation stones for a stronger future. The conspirators' fate served as a perpetual reminder. Karma comes not as swift lightning, but as the inevitable tide, rising slowly but absolutely, drowning those who mistake patience for weakness. The Sullivan name endured, stronger than ever. While those who had tried to destroy it lived on as cautionary tales, their falls as complete as their betrayal had been profound. Lawrence kept only one photo from his previous marriage, not for sentiment, but for perspective. It showed Patricia in the red dress at the gala, celebrating what she thought was her triumph. Beside it, quarterly reports showed Nova Technologies' continuing dominance, each success another stone in the edifice built from his enemy's destruction. Perfect revenge, Lawrence had learned, wasn't just about destroying enemies. It was about using their destruction to build something they could never taint, never touch, and never comprehend. A legacy of justice served cold, complete, and without regret.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.
My wife and I both worked at the same company, though we were in different departments. We usually kept work and home life separate, but occasionally she would mention something interesting about her day. One evening, while we were having dinner, she brought up a new hire in her department. "There's this new girl at work," she said with a tone of excitement. "She's so interesting. You should meet her sometime. She's got this vibe, you know? Really cool." I told her to talk to the girl during her next break if she was that curious. It was practical advice. If you're intrigued, just go and find out more. A couple of days passed, and my wife mentioned that she had gotten to know this new colleague pretty well. "She's got some unique interests," she said, glancing at me with a sly smile. I raised an eyebrow, curious but not overly concerned. I asked her what kind of interests, expecting something about hobbies or lifestyle quirks. Instead, she surprised me with, "Well, let's just say she's got some specific tastes in the bedroom." Her comment caught me off guard. I set down my fork and looked at her. "How do you go from small talk to discussing that in just 2 days?" I asked, keeping my tone even. I wasn't angry, just genuinely curious about how such a conversation unfolded so quickly. My wife shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We're women," she said. "These things come up. It's not like it's a big deal." I nodded, though the explanation didn't entirely satisfy me. I wasn't one to press the issue unnecessarily, so I let it go. It seemed like one of those conversations that didn't require much digging. But it did make me wonder how deep this new friendship had already gotten. My wife wasn't usually one to dive into personal topics with people she'd just met. Later that evening, as we were relaxing on the couch, she brought up the new colleague again. You know, she said, she's actually really smart. She's got a sharp sense of humor, too. I think you'd like her. I simply nodded, not really interested in meeting any of her co-workers unless it was absolutely necessary. Work friendships were her domain, not mine. Over the next couple of days, she continued mentioning this new hire in passing. Each time, there was some new detail. Apparently, the woman was well-traveled, had a unique sense of style, and was full of interesting stories. I'd started tuning most of it out by then, focusing on my own work and routines. My wife had a way of getting fascinated by people, and it usually passed quickly. Then, out of the blue, she said something that caught my attention. You know, she began one evening, her tone lighter than usual. I've been thinking of doing something special. In a couple of days, I've got a little surprise planned for you. Her eyes sparkled with intrigue, and she gave me a mischievous smile. I looked at her, trying to read her expression. What kind of surprise? I asked, my curiosity piqued despite myself. She shook her head, refusing to give me any more details. Just wait. You'll see. It was vague but deliberate, enough to make me wonder what she had in store. She seemed genuinely excited, and I decided to leave it at that, figuring I'd find out soon enough. The way she talked about it left me intrigued but also cautious. Surprises weren't really my thing, but I wasn't one to ruin her fun. Whatever it was, I'd deal with it when the time came. For now, I let her have her moment of excitement and focused on finishing my dinner. The next day, my wife told me we were hosting a barbecue. She seemed excited about it, mentioning that some people from her work were coming over to discuss a project idea. She dropped the names of her friend and her friend's boyfriend, as well as the new colleague and her boyfriend. It sounded casual enough, so I didn't ask too many questions. I took it upon myself to handle the preparations, heading out to buy the meat and other essentials. A barbecue, in my opinion, was straightforward, good food, good company, no unnecessary fuss. When everyone arrived, the atmosphere was easygoing. My wife's friend and her boyfriend were the first to show up, carrying a bottle of wine and a few side dishes. Not long after, the new colleague and her boyfriend walked in. My first impression of the pair was neutral. They seemed polite, but there was something about the way they carried themselves that felt overly casual for a first meeting. Still, I wasn't one to judge too quickly. We set up in the backyard, firing up the grill and laying out the food. Everyone was chatting, sipping drinks, and getting comfortable. I mostly kept to my role as the host, grilling and keeping an eye on the setup. My wife moved between the groups, laughing and talking animatedly. She was in her element, enjoying the company and the conversation. At one point, my wife called everyone together. She had an idea she wanted to propose, something she described as a great way for all of us to bond. We should go on a hiking trip, she said, her enthusiasm infectious. It's the perfect way to get to know each other better, and it'll be fun. I nodded in agreement. I loved hiking, and the thought of getting out into nature was always appealing to me. The others seemed to like the idea as well, and the conversation quickly shifted to planning. As the group talked about potential dates and logistics, I couldn't help but notice the new colleague. She had a way of steering the conversation, often bringing up topics that felt a little too personal for the setting. Her boyfriend was much the same, chiming in with remarks that bordered on inappropriate but stayed just shy of crossing the line. They clearly complemented each other in that regard. I kept my observations to myself, focusing instead on the barbecue. The evening wore on, and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. The wine flowed a little more freely, and the conversations became more animated. My wife's friend and her boyfriend were discussing hiking trails, while the new colleague shared stories about her past adventures, though they inevitably veered into discussions of her more unusual hobbies. It wasn't overtly shocking, but it was enough to make me raise an eyebrow. Eventually, the group settled on a date for the hiking trip. The excitement was palpable, and everyone seemed genuinely invested in making it happen. My wife was beaming, clearly pleased with how the evening had gone. I stayed in the background, content to let her take the lead. It was her idea, after all, and she had a way of organizing things that usually worked out. As the night wrapped up, people began to say their goodbyes. The new colleague and her boyfriend were the first to leave, followed by my wife's friend and her partner. The house felt quiet again once they were gone. My wife and I cleaned up together, talking about the trip and the plans we'd made. She seemed happy, and I was glad the evening had gone smoothly. With the date set, we had something to look forward to, and for now, that was enough. The day of the hike finally arrived. Everyone showed up on time, their energy high and spirits eager. We had rented all the necessary gear in advance, ensuring no one lacked anything essential for the trip. I took it upon myself to double-check everything. I wasn't about to let poor preparation ruin the outing. My wife seemed especially enthusiastic, buzzing around the group and keeping the momentum going. Once we were all set, we headed into the woods, the excitement palpable. The trail was scenic, with towering trees providing shade and a gentle breeze keeping us cool. We moved at a steady pace, occasionally stopping to take pictures or point out something interesting. The group dynamic was relaxed, with laughter and casual conversation filling the air. My wife's friend and her boyfriend were particularly animated, swapping stories about their previous hiking trips. The new colleague and her boyfriend lagged slightly behind, engaged in their own private conversation. I kept to the front, setting the pace and enjoying the tranquility of the forest. After a few hours, we found a clearing and decided it was a good spot to set up camp. Everyone pitched in to lay out the blankets and unpack the food. The spread was modest but satisfying, with sandwiches, fruits, and snacks providing enough energy for the day. We ate together, the camaraderie growing stronger as we shared stories and jokes. It felt good to unwind and connect with the group, though I kept my focus on practical matters, ensuring everything was running smoothly. As evening fell, we gathered around a small fire. The mood shifted slightly, becoming more reflective as the conversation turned to deeper topics. It was then that the new colleague's boyfriend spoke up. "Do you ever feel like life gets too routine?" he asked, his tone contemplative. Everyone nodded, intrigued by the direction the discussion was taking. He continued, "Sometimes you need to break out of that. Try something different. Something that shakes things up." He and his girlfriend went on to share their experience with swinger parties, speaking candidly about how it had brought a new dimension to their relationship. My wife's friend and her boyfriend seemed genuinely curious, asking questions and engaging in the discussion. I, on the other hand, was less than impressed. While I kept my expression neutral, I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. This wasn't the kind of topic I expected around a campfire, especially with people I barely knew. What bothered me more was the way my wife reacted. She was completely engrossed, her eyes alight with curiosity as she asked questions and listened intently. It wasn't like her to be so captivated by something so out of character. I observed her quietly, noting her enthusiasm but choosing not to comment. It wasn't the time or place for a confrontation, and I wasn't about to cause a scene in front of everyone. The conversation eventually shifted to other topics, and the atmosphere lightened again. We talked about future plans, shared more stories, and enjoyed the warmth of the fire. By the time we called it a night, the earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by the usual camaraderie. Everyone seemed satisfied with how the day had gone, and we retired to our tents, ready to rest before the journey back. The next morning, we packed up and prepared to leave. The group was in good spirits despite the previous night's odd turn of conversation. We retraced our steps back to the cars, the hike down uneventful but pleasant. By the time we reached the parking lot, everyone was ready to head home. The trip had been a success on the surface, but I couldn't shake the lingering unease from the night before. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself as we said our goodbyes and went our separate ways. After we had both caught up on some much-needed sleep, I decided to address the conversation from the night before. Over breakfast, I brought it up. "Listen," I said, keeping my tone firm but calm, "that whole talk about swinger parties from last night? I'm not a fan. Frankly, I find it pretty disgusting." I watched her reaction closely, expecting her to agree or at least shrug it off. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Really?" she asked. "You're telling me you wouldn't even be a little curious? Never wondered what it might be like?" Her tone was light, almost teasing, but the question landed like a punch. I put down my coffee and stared at her, dumbfounded. "Are you serious?" I asked. "How could I even consider something like that? It's cheating, plain and simple. What are you trying to say by even asking me that?" My voice was steady, but the edge of disbelief was clear. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that she would even entertain the idea. She held up her hands in mock surrender, still smiling faintly. "Relax," she said. "I'm not saying I want to do it. I was just curious about your reaction. You know how people always say forbidden fruit is the sweetest. Sometimes, it's just interesting to think about, that's all." Her explanation didn't sit right with me, but I decided to let it slide for the moment. There was no point in escalating the conversation further when it was already uncomfortable enough. Then she dropped another bombshell. "By the way," she said, as casually as if she were mentioning the weather, "my friend texted me earlier. You won't believe this, but they actually tried it. Right after the hike." I blinked at her, not sure I'd heard correctly. "Wait," I said, "you're saying they went to one of those parties?" "Just like that?" She nodded, clearly amused by my reaction. "And guess what?" she continued. "She loved it. She said it was an amazing experience and that they'd definitely do it again." I didn't know how to respond to that. The idea of it alone made me uncomfortable, and now it was something my wife's close friend was openly endorsing. I focused on finishing my meal, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. My wife seemed entirely unbothered, scrolling through her phone as if the conversation hadn't just taken a bizarre turn. "Anyway," she said after a moment, "she invited me for coffee in a couple of days. She wants to tell me all about it, and, we'll catch up on other gossip too." She said it so nonchalantly, like it was just another casual meetup. I gave her a nod, masking my unease. For now, I'd let her have her coffee date. But the direction these conversations were heading didn't sit well with me, and I knew I'd need to keep an eye on things moving forward. The day my wife went out for coffee with her friend, I got a call from one of my work buddies. They were planning to meet up for a few beers after work and invited me to join. It sounded like a good opportunity to unwind, so I agreed. After finishing my tasks for the day, I headed to our usual spot, a cozy bar not far from the office. By the time I arrived, a couple of the guys were already there, laughing and swapping stories. We grabbed a table in the corner, and the conversation flowed naturally. At first, it was the usual banter about work, deadlines, client headaches, and office gossip. Then someone brought up the new hires, which inevitably led to talk about my wife's new colleague. "You've heard about her, right?" one of the guys asked, leaning in conspiratorially. "Apparently, she's already making waves." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of waves?" I asked, genuinely curious. The guy smirked. "Well, there's talk that she's been flirting with a few people in the office. And get this, she's apparently inviting them to some kind of swinger party." There was a collective chuckle around the table, though the tone was more incredulous than amused. "That's ridiculous," I said, shaking my head. "She and her boyfriend came on a hike with us not too long ago, and they were trying to sell that same nonsense to my wife's friends. It's like they're recruiting people for their lifestyle." The group's laughter died down as the conversation took a more serious tone. "Sounds like trouble," one of the guys said. "If she's really pulling that stuff at work, it could cause problems for the whole office. Honestly, if it were me, I'd keep my wife away from her. You don't want her getting caught up in that mess." The others nodded in agreement, and I took a moment to consider his words. "It's already bad enough that she's got her friend interested," I said. "This whole thing just feels wrong. People are treating it like a joke, but it's not funny when it starts affecting relationships." They all agreed, and the conversation shifted to other topics. Still, the unease lingered in the back of my mind. The idea of that colleague spreading her influence around the office didn't sit well with me. As the evening went on, the group slowly began to disband. One by one, the guys finished their drinks and headed home. I stayed a little longer, nursing my beer and mulling over the conversation. By the time I decided to leave, the bar was nearly empty. I said my goodbyes and stepped out into the cool night air. The drive home was quiet, giving me time to think. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were escalating in a direction I didn't like. My wife's growing interest in her colleague's lifestyle, coupled with the rumors I'd just heard, made me uneasy. But I reminded myself that I couldn't jump to conclusions. For now, all I could do was stay vigilant and keep an eye on how things developed. When I got home that evening, my wife was waiting for me in the living room. She looked excited about something, a sparkle in her eye that made me brace myself for whatever she was about to say. "Guess what?" she began, not waiting for a response. "My colleague is organizing a party, and we're invited. It's going to be great. My friend and her boyfriend are coming too." Her enthusiasm was clear, but it didn't take me long to piece together what kind of party she was talking about. "You're not going," I said firmly, cutting through her excitement. Her smile faltered, and she stared at me, taken aback by my bluntness. "I don't want you hanging around that colleague anymore," I continued. "She's trouble, and you've seen what's happened to our friends because of her influence. I won't have her dragging us into the same mess." She blinked, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Excuse me," she said, her tone rising. "Are you seriously telling me who I can and can't be friends with? Do you even hear yourself? You're acting like a control freak." Her words came fast, each one laced with frustration. She was clearly not expecting me to put my foot down. I didn't back down. "Call it what you want," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But I know what's right, and this isn't it. I'm not going to pretend that what she's doing is normal or acceptable. You've heard the rumors about her inviting half the office to these parties. Think about the kind of reputation she's building for herself. Do you really want to be associated with that?" My wife's frustration boiled over. "This isn't about her," she snapped. "This is about you not trusting me. I can make my own decisions, and I don't need you telling me what I can or can't do." She stormed off, slamming the door to the bedroom behind her. I stood there for a moment, letting the tension settle. I wasn't about to back down from what I believed was the right decision, but her reaction made it clear this wasn't the end of the conversation. Later that night, my phone buzzed. It was one of my friends from work, the same guy who'd been at the bar earlier. "Hey," he said, his voice casual. "I heard about this party your wife's colleague is throwing. Why aren't you letting her go? And why aren't you going?" His question was direct, but there was no malice in it, just curiosity. "Because I don't support that kind of thing," I replied. "It's against everything I believe in, and I'm not about to let my wife get involved in it either. It's not just a party, it's a whole lifestyle that I don't agree with. I won't compromise my principles for something like this." There was a pause on the other end before he spoke again. "Fair enough," he said. "I respect your perspective, man. You've always been straightforward about where you stand. Just thought I'd ask." His tone was genuine, and I appreciated that he didn't push further. "Thanks," I said. "I'm glad you get where I'm coming from." He wrapped up the call with a simple "take care," leaving me to my thoughts. While I still felt the weight of the disagreement with my wife, it was reassuring to know that at least someone understood my position. The office had been buzzing with rumors all week. Whispers floated through the halls about who was planning to attend the upcoming party and who wasn't. The date and time had even leaked, giving everyone something to talk about during coffee breaks. While I didn't involve myself in the gossip, it was impossible not to overhear bits and pieces. My focus remained on my work, but the chatter served as a constant reminder of the influence that colleague was wielding. It seemed like half the office was caught up in her orbit, and it only reinforced my decision to keep my wife away from her. That evening, I returned home, tired but glad to leave the noise of the office behind. As I was settling in, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her tone was warm but carried a sense of urgency. Your father needs a hand with the garage, she said. Everything is nearly done, but there are a few final touches we can't manage on our own. Can you come by tomorrow? I didn't hesitate to agree. Family came first, and if they needed my help, I'd be there. After hanging up, I turned to my wife to let her know about the trip. I need to head to my parents' place tomorrow, I said. Just for the day. My dad needs help finishing up the garage. It won't take long. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and looked up with a casual nod. Okay, she said. I was thinking of meeting up with my friend anyway. Might be a good chance to catch up. Her response was nonchalant, but I didn't let the conversation end there. Listen, I said, my tone firm but not harsh. I need you to promise me something. Don't do anything questionable while I'm gone. You know how important this is to me. I'm trying to keep us on solid ground here. I watched her closely, wanting to ensure she understood the seriousness of what I was saying. She raised an eyebrow, clearly not thrilled with my request. Seriously, she said. You think I'm just going to go wild the moment you're out the door? Give me some credit. Her tone was slightly defensive, but I wasn't about to back down. It's not about trust, I said. It's about keeping our priorities straight. I care about us, and I don't want anything jeopardizing that. She sighed, clearly annoyed but unwilling to argue further. Fine, she said. I promise I won't do anything crazy. You've got my word. While her words were reassuring, her tone left me with lingering doubts. Still, I chose to take her at face value. There was no point in pushing the matter further, especially when I had other things to focus on. I nodded, letting the conversation wind down. Good, I said. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. I'm only gone for a day, and when I get back, we'll move forward together. She gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. It was enough for now, or at least that's what I told myself. As she turned her attention back to her phone, she made a parting comment. Okay, she said, waving a hand dismissively. But let's not start another lecture about the same thing. I get it. You don't need to hit replay on this topic every time. Her words stung a bit, but I let it slide. The important thing was that she'd given me her word. She looked up once more, her tone softening slightly. All right, fine. Just don't worry so much, okay? I'll meet my friend, have some coffee, and that'll be it. No drama. But seriously, no need for the same old speech again. With that, she returned to her scrolling, and I left her to it, hoping she'd stick to her promise. As I sat at a red light on my way to my parents' house, my phone buzzed with notifications. It was the group chat with the guys from work. I glanced at it briefly, noting the usual banter and jokes. Then a new message popped up. Someone asked, "So, who's actually going to that party tonight? It's supposed to be happening soon." A few responses trickled in, most of them dismissive or joking. One guy replied, "I'm single, so why not? I'll go just to see what all the fuss is about." The casual tone made it seem like no big deal, but it still irked me. I locked my phone and focused on the road, trying not to let it get under my skin. When I arrived at my parents' house, my father was already outside, waiting with a toolbox in hand. The garage was nearly finished, but it needed a few adjustments before it could be called complete. We got to work quickly, measuring, hammering, and installing the last few fixtures. It felt good to do something productive, something tangible. My dad and I had always worked well together on projects like this, and it gave me a sense of accomplishment. As we worked, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video message from one of the guys in the chat. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The clip was shaky, clearly recorded on a phone, showing what appeared to be the party in question. The room was dimly lit, filled with people milling about, laughing, and drinking. Then the camera panned, and my heart skipped a beat. Among the crowd, I caught a glimpse of a dress that looked unsettlingly familiar. It was the same color and style as one my wife owned, one she'd worn recently. I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening. Could it really be her? The angle wasn't clear enough to be certain, but the possibility gnawed at me. I called the guy who had sent the video, keeping my voice steady. "Hey, do me a favor," I said. "Can you look around and see if my wife's there? She might be wearing a dress like the one you just showed." There was a pause before he responded, his tone casual. "Sure, give me a minute." I continued working with my dad, though my mind was far from the task at hand. Minutes felt like hours until the guy finally texted back. "Didn't see her," he wrote. "Probably not there." "Relax, man." His response was meant to reassure me, but it didn't. The uncertainty lingered, and I knew I couldn't shake it until I got home and saw for myself. I wrapped up the work as quickly as I could, pushing through the final tasks with a renewed sense of urgency. My dad noticed my distraction but didn't press me on it. Once we finished, I packed up my tools and told my parents I needed to head back. My mom stopped me on the way out, her expression concerned. "Is everything okay?" she asked. I hesitated, then told them about the video and my suspicion. My father frowned, crossing his arms. "You need to be careful," he said. "Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment, but don't ignore your instincts either. If something doesn't feel right, act on it." My mom nodded in agreement. "Just make sure you protect yourself," she added. "Whatever's going on, you need to be prepared." Their advice was practical, but it didn't ease the knot in my chest. I thanked them, promising to keep them updated, and got in my car. As I drove back, my thoughts raced. The words of my parents echoed in my mind, "Protect yourself first." It was a sobering reminder of what might lie ahead. I pulled into the driveway, my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I turned off the engine, I noticed a figure at the front door. It was my wife, fumbling with her keys, clearly struggling to keep her balance. She was wearing the same dress I glimpsed in the video earlier, and her movements were unsteady. My heart pounded as I got out of the car, closing the door quietly and walking briskly toward her. By the time I reached her, she had managed to open the door and was stumbling inside. Her condition was worse than I'd expected. Her dress was soaked in some kind of white liquid, and the smell of alcohol hit me like a wall. All this liquid was dripping from her, even from her head. She barely acknowledged my presence as she staggered toward the living room, collapsing onto the couch without a word. Within moments, she was asleep, her breathing heavy and uneven. I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing. The state she was in was alarming, but I couldn't ignore the anger bubbling beneath my confusion. I walked over to her, noticing the stains on her clothes and the disheveled state of her hair. It was clear she'd been at the party, and whatever had happened there had gone far beyond what I'd anticipated. Her phone was lying on the coffee table, its screen lighting up with notifications. I hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. The lock screen showed messages from group chats, but it was the videos that caught my eye. A few were recent, taken within the last couple of hours. My pulse quickened as I opened one, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. The video showed her at the party, surrounded by familiar faces from her office. It didn't take long to see what had transpired. The footage was explicit, leaving no room for misinterpretation. She had been with 6 different men, all of whom I recognized as her co-workers. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I had to steady myself against the table to keep from losing my composure. I forced myself to keep watching, not out of morbid curiosity, but because I needed to understand the full extent of what had happened. Each clip painted the same picture, a betrayal that was as blatant as it was devastating. My hands clenched the phone tightly as I navigated through the files, my anger growing with each passing second. Once I'd seen enough, I transferred the videos to my own phone. The process was mechanical, my mind numb to everything but the task at hand. I knew I needed to have evidence, not just for myself but for whatever steps I might need to take next. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on me, but I refused to let it overwhelm me. With the files safely stored, I placed her phone back on the table. She was still fast asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. For a moment, I simply stood there, watching her in silence. The woman I thought I knew had crossed a line I couldn't ignore, and there was no going back from what I discovered tonight. For now, I left her where she was, allowing her to sleep off the night while I prepared for what would come next. The words of my parents echoed in my mind, "Protect yourself first." As I sat alone in the kitchen, the reality of the situation began to sink in fully. There was no time for hesitation or second-guessing. I had to act swiftly and decisively. My first move was to secure our finances. I logged into the online banking accounts, transferring all the money from both my accounts and hers into one that was solely under my parents' names. It wasn't theft, it was safeguarding what belonged to us, or, more accurately, what was left of my trust. Once that was done, I moved to the physical cash we kept at home. There was a small stash in a safe, something we had agreed upon for emergencies. I took every last bill, placing it into a sturdy envelope, and headed out to the garage. Beneath an old stack of tires, I created a hiding spot that I knew she wouldn't think to look for. It wasn't the most secure location, but it was out of sight and would serve its purpose for the time being. I paused for a moment, looking around the garage. It had always been a space of order and utility, a place where I came to work on projects or clear my head. Now, it felt like a makeshift fortress, a place to shield myself from the fallout of what was to come. I returned to the house, steeling myself for the next step in my plan. Sitting at my desk, I created a new, anonymous email account. The process was straightforward, but each keystroke carried the weight of the decision I was making. I needed to expose what had happened, not out of revenge, but to ensure there were consequences for her actions. It wasn't just about me anymore, her behavior could potentially harm others, including the company where we both worked. With the account set up, I began drafting an email. The recipient, the CEO of our company. The subject line was concise, but impactful, urgent, employee conduct risk. I attached the videos I had transferred earlier, ensuring that each file was clearly labeled. In the body of the email, I outlined the situation. I kept the tone professional, emphasizing the potential reputational damage her actions could cause to the organization. The attached videos document behavior that goes against the values and professional standards of our workplace, I wrote. As someone in a position of leadership, I believe it's in the company's best interest to address this matter promptly. Failure to do so may result in broader repercussions that could tarnish the company's reputation. I read through the email multiple times, making sure it struck the right balance of urgency and professionalism. Once satisfied, I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the send button. This wasn't an action I could take back, but it was necessary. The damage had already been done, and protecting myself and my integrity meant following through. I pressed send, watching as the email disappeared from my screen. There was no turning back now. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling deeply. The hardest part was over, or so I thought. My phone buzzed with notifications from the group chat, but I ignored them. My focus remained on the actions I'd taken. Exposing the truth was a step toward reclaiming control, and I was determined to see it through to the end. Morning arrived with the sharp sound of my wife's phone ringing. She stirred, groaning as she reached for it, still clearly groggy from the night before. As she answered, I could hear the voice on the other end of the line. Her colleague was yelling, so loudly that I could make out some of the words even from across the room. Phrases like disgrace, videos, and fired stood out, cutting through the muffled noise. My wife sat up abruptly, her face a mixture of confusion and panic as she tried to process what she was hearing. Her colleague's voice continued, detailing how the videos had been sent to the company's leadership and circulated among other employees. The fallout had been immediate. The director had taken swift action, firing those involved, and the office was now rife with rumors and speculation. My wife's expression darkened as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She barely managed to stammer a few words before the call ended, leaving her staring blankly at the phone. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. She turned to look at me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Her eyes darted over me, then down at herself. She was still wearing the stained dress from the night before, her hair disheveled, and the strong scent of alcohol lingered in the air. I could see the gears turning in her head as she pieced together the events leading to this moment. "Doesn't it bother you?" I asked, my tone calm but pointed. "Waking up like this, knowing what you've done?" My words hit their mark, and her face twisted into a mix of shame and anger. She didn't bother to deny anything, instead launching into a tirade. "You did this," she yelled, her voice rising. "You're the one who set this all up. You're the reason this is happening. Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" I stood my ground, meeting her glare with steady resolve. "What I've done?" I asked. "You're blaming me for the consequences of your actions? You're the one who crossed the line, and now you're dealing with the fallout. Don't try to make this about me." My voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Her attempt to shift the blame only solidified my decision. She tried to argue, her words a chaotic mix of anger and desperation, but I'd heard enough. "That's enough," I said, cutting her off. "You need to leave. You've made your choices, and now I'm making mine. This isn't your home anymore." The weight of my words hung in the air, and for the first time, she seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. The night before, I had already taken steps to prepare for this moment. Her belongings were packed and waiting by the door. It wasn't much, just the essentials she'd need to get by for the time being. I had no interest in a drawn-out confrontation or lingering complications. My priority was making a clean break and moving forward. She stared at the packed bags, her expression shifting between disbelief and fury. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling. But I was. I pointed to the door, making it clear that there was no room for negotiation. "Take your things and go," I said. "You've made your bed. Now you have to lie in it." Reluctantly, she gathered her things, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. I didn't say another word as she walked out, closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was heavy but also liberating. For the first time in days, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. She was gone, and with her departure came the promise of a new beginning. The fallout from the videos was swift and brutal. My wife's presence in them had been unmistakable, and the company's leadership acted decisively. Despite the chaos that had already unfolded, the professional consequences hit her the hardest. Early in the day, she was called into a meeting with HR and senior management. From what I later heard, the tone of the meeting was serious but firm. They explained that her actions had created an untenable situation for the company, one that posed significant reputational risks. There was no room for negotiation. She was terminated on the spot, effective immediately. Her attempts to explain or justify her behavior fell on deaf ears. The leadership's decision was final, and they made it clear that there was no path to redemption in their eyes. The weight of her actions had caught up with her, and there was no escaping the consequences. By the time she left the office, word had already spread among her colleagues. The whispers and stares followed her out the door. According to a mutual acquaintance, she broke down in tears as she packed up her desk. The humiliation was palpable, and she reportedly begged for understanding from those around her. But the damage was done. The videos had circulated widely, and even those who might have been sympathetic kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with her scandal. She walked out of the building with her box of belongings, her career in tatters. At home, the silence was deafening. I knew she had no intention of coming back, and I had no intention of letting her. The house felt emptier without her presence, but that emptiness was a relief rather than a burden. I spent the day reflecting on the events that had led us here, my resolve strengthening with each passing hour. There was no going back to the way things were, and I didn't want to. My next step was to make everything official. That evening, I picked up the phone and called an attorney. The conversation was brief but direct. I explained the situation, detailing the betrayal and the evidence I had gathered. The lawyer listened attentively, offering practical advice on how to proceed. He assured me that the case was straightforward and that the divorce would likely be resolved quickly given the circumstances. I felt a sense of clarity as we discussed the legal steps ahead. While waiting for the paperwork to be drafted, I reflected on what this meant for my future. The marriage I had once valued was irreparably broken, but I didn't feel regret for taking the steps I had. My focus now was on rebuilding my life and ensuring that I moved forward without the weight of her actions dragging me down. The process was methodical, each step a reminder that I was taking control of my own narrative. The attorney worked efficiently, and within days, the divorce proceedings were underway. I made sure every detail was handled with care, ensuring that there would be no loose ends or complications. The evidence I provided left no room for dispute, and the process moved forward without delay. Each milestone in the legal proceedings brought a sense of closure, a reassurance that I was making the right choices. In the end, the divorce was finalized without much contention. The separation was clean, the assets divided as agreed, and I was left with the freedom to start anew. It was a bittersweet conclusion, but one that was necessary. As I signed the final documents, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The chapter was closed, and I was ready to move forward, leaving the past behind. Not long after the divorce was finalized, my quiet evening was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I approached cautiously. Through the peephole, I saw my ex-wife standing with her colleague, the very one responsible for much of this chaos. Their expressions were a mix of anger and determination, and I immediately knew this wouldn't be a pleasant visit. I opened the door slightly, enough to hear them out, but not enough to let them in. My ex-wife wasted no time, launching into accusations. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" she demanded. Her colleague chimed in, backing her up with vague threats about retaliation and making my life difficult. Their words were sharp, but their desperation was evident. It was clear they were grasping at straws, trying to regain some semblance of control over a situation that had spiraled out of their hands. I stood there calmly, letting them rant without reacting. When they finally paused, expecting a response, I simply said, "We're done here." Without another word, I closed the door in their faces. The lock clicked into place, a satisfying reminder that I had changed all the locks weeks ago. I had no reason to worry about them trying to force their way back into my life. Whatever they thought they could accomplish by showing up unannounced, it had failed. From the other side of the door, I could hear their muffled voices as they continued to argue among themselves. I didn't bother trying to make out the words. Instead, I walked back to the living room and sat down, letting the encounter roll off me like water off a duck's back. I had already taken all the necessary precautions to ensure they couldn't interfere with my life anymore. The locks, the finances, the clean break, everything was in place. They could huff and puff all they wanted, but they no longer had any power over me. The incident, while mildly annoying, only reinforced my decision to move forward. It was a reminder of the toxicity I had left behind and the importance of maintaining boundaries. I didn't let it linger in my mind for long. Instead, I turned my attention to more productive things, like planning for the future and focusing on the people who truly mattered in my life. Later that evening, I received a call from an old friend. It was one of the guys who had been caught up in the mess with my ex-wife and her colleague. I hadn't spoken to him much since everything went down, so his call came as a surprise. "Hey," he started, his tone cautious but sincere. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I wanted to say thank you." I was taken aback. "Thank me? For what?" I asked. He sighed, as if gathering his thoughts. "For waking me up," he said. "When you exposed everything, it forced me to take a hard look at my own life and the choices I was making. My partner and I had a serious conversation, and we realized how far off track we'd gotten. It wasn't easy, but we've started to rebuild, and it's all because you had the guts to do what needed to be done." His words caught me off guard, but they also filled me with a sense of validation. I hadn't set out to change anyone else's life, but knowing that my actions had a positive ripple effect was reassuring. He continued, "Look, I owe you a drink. Let's meet up sometime soon. I want to catch up and thank you properly." I agreed, feeling a small weight lift off my shoulders. The chaos of the past few weeks had been overwhelming, but moments like this reminded me that doing the right thing often comes with unexpected rewards. As I hung up the phone, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was time to move on, one step at a time, surrounded by people who valued honesty and integrity.
Welcome back, and thank you for tuning into Cheating Tales Lab. We appreciate every single one of you. We'd love to know what part of the world are you watching from right now. Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. Nathan Pierce stood at his office window, 40 stories above Seattle's bustling financial district. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk, where the latest prototype of Pierce Innovations' revolutionary cardiac monitoring device lay. His fingers traced the smooth edges of the device that promised to revolutionize early heart attack detection. A soft buzz from his phone interrupted his thoughts. Claire's message lit up the screen. "Meet me at La Maison Rouge at 7. Remember our first date there? Time to celebrate something special." 18 years of memories. Nathan's steel-gray eyes narrowed slightly. Something in the phrasing felt off. Claire had been distant lately, always traveling for work with her consulting firm. Their conversations had become perfunctory, lacking the warmth they once shared. Still, 18 years of marriage had taught him to read between the lines. This wasn't just about anniversary nostalgia. "Jennifer," he called to his assistant through the intercom. "Clear my evening schedule." "Already done, Mr. Pierce. And the board meeting for tomorrow's expansion plan is confirmed. Should I have the financial projections ready?" "No need. James said he'd handle the presentation." Nathan's jaw tightened imperceptibly at mentioning his business partner. Something had been nagging at him about James Harrison's recent behavior, subtle changes in his demeanor, closed-door phone calls, missing documentation from their overseas subsidiaries. On his way out, Nathan stopped at Winston and Gray Florists. "The usual, Mr. Pierce?" Thomas, the elderly owner, reached for the premium roses. "Claire's favorites. Some things shouldn't change." Nathan paid, remembering how Claire's eyes had lit up when he'd brought her these same roses on their first date at La Maison Rouge. Back then, he'd been a struggling entrepreneur with big dreams, and she'd been a brilliant economics major who believed in his vision. The restaurant hadn't changed much in 18 years. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over cream-colored walls, and the soft murmur of conversation mixed with gentle piano music. The maitre d' recognized him immediately. "Mr. Pierce, welcome back. Your wife is already seated." He hesitated slightly. "With another gentleman." Nathan's measured stride didn't falter as he approached the table, but his grip on the roses tightened when he saw James Harrison sitting entirely too close to Claire, their heads bent together in intimate conversation. Claire looked up, her perfectly painted red lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Darling, you're right on time." She wore the diamond necklace Nathan had given her for their 15th anniversary, but somehow it looked different on her now, cold, like armor rather than adornment. James didn't bother standing, just raised his whiskey glass in a mock salute. "Nathan, join us for this special occasion." The roses fell forgotten to an empty chair as Nathan noticed the thick manila envelope on the table. Years of high-stakes business negotiations had taught him to maintain composure in any situation. He pulled out a chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Quite the setup you have here." His voice carried no emotion. "I assume that envelope explains why my business partner is dining with my wife?" Claire's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Always so perceptive. That's what I admired about you, darling." She slid the envelope across the crisp white tablecloth. Though apparently not perceptive enough, Nathan opened the envelope, methodically reviewing each document. The waiter approached, but a sharp gesture from Nathan sent him retreating. The only sound was the rustle of papers and the continuing piano melody, now seeming discordant and mocking. "Impressive," he finally said, looking up at Claire. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning?" Claire sipped her wine, an expensive Bordeaux that Nathan recognized from their cellar at home. "Oh, this isn't just planning. This is years of careful execution." "Show him the best part, James." James pulled out another document with flourish. Your recent expansion plan? Every bank rejected your loan applications because they saw some adjusted numbers. His smirk grew wider. You're not just losing the company, Nathan. You're bankrupt. Don't forget to tell him about us, dear, James added, placing his hand over Claire's. Oh yes. Claire's smile turned predatory. James and I have been together for 3 years. He knows how to appreciate a woman with business acumen. All those late nights at the office? We weren't always working on spreadsheets. Nathan sat back, studying them both. Where others might see shock or devastation on his face, there was only cold calculation. Every piece was falling into place. The late-night calls Claire claimed were work emergencies, James's insistence on handling all investor relations, the mysterious withdrawals from company accounts that accounting couldn't explain. 3 years, Nathan repeated softly. Around the time you suggested James should take over our European expansion, he needed full access to our international accounts. Nathan continued, his voice steady. And you, Claire, needed someone on the inside. Tell me, was I always the target? Or did James pick me out for you? Claire's smile faltered slightly at his calm demeanor. Does it matter? Sign the transfer documents, and we can all move on civilly. You've lost, Nathan. Accept it gracefully. Before I sign, Nathan pulled out a pin, his signet ring catching the light. I'm curious about one thing. The Thompson merger last year, that was when you started moving significant shares through your shell companies, wasn't it? James shifted uncomfortably. Just sign the damn papers, Nathan. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're right. Why drag this out? Nathan's pen moved across the paper, his signature as strong and confident as ever. I assume my key card will be deactivated by morning? Sooner, Claire said, gathering the documents. You know, I almost feel bad about this. You did build something impressive. We'll take good care of Pierce Innovations. I'm sure you will. Nathan stood, straightening his tie. Enjoy your dinner. The 82 Bordeaux pairs well with betrayal, I hear. He walked out of La Maison Rouge, past the concerned glances of the staff who'd known him for years. The night air hit his face, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out his phone and sent a single text. It's done. They took the bait. Behind him, through the restaurant's window, Claire and James clinked glasses, celebrating their victory. They didn't notice the distinguished-looking man at the bar who'd been nursing the same drink all evening, or the woman dining alone who'd barely touched her food while typing constantly on her laptop. Nathan's driver, Robert, opened the car door. Home, sir? No. Nathan checked his watch. Take me to the office. I have some calls to make. Rough night? Robert had been with Nathan for 15 years and knew his moods well. Just the opposite. Nathan's reflection in the car window showed no sign of a man who just lost everything. Some people are so focused on winning, they forget to check if they're playing the right game. As the car pulled away, Nathan removed his wedding ring, studying it in the passing streetlights before placing it in his pocket. There would be time for sentiment later. Right now, he had work to do. In the restaurant, Claire was already on the phone with their offshore account manager, her voice thick with triumph. Everything's proceeding as planned. Start the transfers tonight. James watched her with admiration and a touch of fear. He'd seen what happened to people who underestimated Claire Pierce, soon to be Claire Harrison. At least, that was the plan they discussed. Somehow, looking at her now, he wondered if he really knew her at all. The waiter brought their dessert, a chocolate souffle ordered to celebrate. Compliments of Mr. Pierce, he said quietly. He called it in this morning. Claire's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. This morning? For a moment, doubt crept into her perfect plan. She pushed it aside, reminding herself that Nathan had always been sentimental. That's what made him such an easy target. To us, James raised his glass, pushing away his own flicker of unease. And to Pierce Innovations' bright future. Outside, a light rain began to fall on Seattle's streets, washing away the last traces of a marriage built on lies and a partnership founded on betrayal. But in his office high above the city, Nathan Pierce was just beginning his real work. The night was still young, and he had 18 years of trust to repay with interest. The cleaning staff noticed him there well past midnight, his office light a lone beacon in the darkened building. If any of them thought it strange to see the CEO working so late, they didn't mention it. They'd grown used to his dedication over the years. What they didn't see was his phone conversation, conducted in hushed tones near the window. Everything recorded? A woman's voice responded, crystal clear, Mr. Pierce. Both video and audio from multiple angles. Agent Rodriguez says it's better than they hoped for. Good. Nathan watched the city lights below, each one representing a life untouched by the kind of betrayal he'd experienced. Keep monitoring their communications. They'll be moving quickly now. Sir? The woman hesitated. I'm sorry about everything. Don't be, Sarah. Some things need to break before they can be rebuilt properly. He ended the call and turned back to his desk, where the prototype still sat, a reminder of what he'd built and what he would protect. Tomorrow, Claire and James would begin dismantling his life's work, thinking they'd won. They didn't realize they were actually helping him set a trap years in the making. Nathan allowed himself a small smile as he remembered Claire's words. Time to see who really built Pierce Innovations. Indeed it was. The roses lay forgotten on the restaurant chair, their deep red petals a stark contrast to the white linen. Like everything else about this night, they weren't what they appeared to be. Nathan had chosen them not for romance, but as a marker helping the surveillance team identify his table from a distance. In their penthouse apartment, Claire was packing an overnight bag, her movements efficient and purposeful. She picked up a framed photo from their wedding day, studied it for a moment, then dropped it in the trash. The glass cracked, splintering across Nathan's smiling face. Sentimental fool, she murmured. But her hand shook slightly as she zipped the bag. 18 years was a long time to play a role, even for someone as skilled as she was. Part of her had almost grown comfortable in the life she'd built with Nathan. Almost. But comfort didn't build empires. Looking out at the same city view Nathan had observed earlier, she saw not beauty but opportunity. Seattle had been a stepping stone, nothing more. By this time next week, she and James would be restructuring Pierce Innovations, stripping it for parts before moving on to their next target. She didn't know that 20 floors below, in a nondescript apartment filled with surveillance equipment, Sarah Chen was already unraveling the threads of her carefully constructed plan. The former FBI forensic accountant had spent 6 months building a case, and tonight's confession was the final piece she needed. In his private office at Pierce Innovations, Nathan opened his wall safe and removed a thick file, one that even Claire didn't know existed. Inside were photographs, bank statements, and detailed reports tracking his wife's activities over the past year. He'd learned long ago that trust was good, but verification was better. The night stretched on, each player moving their pieces into position for the next day's game. But that would be another act, with its own revelations and consequences. For now, the setup was complete, the trap was set, and the players had shown their hands. Nathan Pierce, the man they thought they'd destroyed, sat in his office and waited for dawn. He'd built his company from nothing once before. If necessary, he could do it again. But first, he had a debt to settle, not with money, but with justice. The roses wilted in the empty restaurant, their perfume fading into the night air. Like the marriage they represented, they had been nothing but a prop in an elaborate performance. But unlike Claire's calculated betrayal, Nathan's performance was far from over. The real show was about to begin. Sarah Chun sat in her darkened office, surrounded by monitors displaying surveillance feeds from La Maison Rouge. 6 months of meticulous investigation had led to this moment. As Pierce Innovations head of security, few knew her real background as an FBI forensic accountant, exactly as Nathan had planned. Target is moving. Her earpiece crackled. Mrs. Pierce just sent a secure message to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, intercepting the encrypted communication. Got it. Start recording all network traffic from their devices. Through the restaurant's cameras, she watched Nathan maintain his composure as Claire and James gloated over their apparent victory. Most men would have crumbled seeing their life's work stolen by their wife and best friend. But Nathan Pierce wasn't most men. 6 months earlier, Ms. Chen, Nathan had said during their first meeting, "I need someone who can follow money trails that don't want to be followed." Sarah remembered studying him across his desk, noting his careful choice of words. "You suspect internal fraud?" I suspect something far more elaborate. He'd slid a folder across his desk. These are discrepancies in our international accounts. Small enough to miss individually, but together, they form a pattern, Sarah finished, scanning the documents. How long? 3 years of consistent anomalies. All authorized by my CFO, James Harrison, and your wife's consulting firm handles your European operations, Sarah added, connecting the dots. That's quite a coincidence. Nathan's smile hadn't reached his eyes. I don't believe in coincidences, Ms. Chan. Neither does the FBI. Present time. The restaurant surveillance feed showed Claire sliding another document across the table. Sarah zoomed in, capturing every page through the high-resolution cameras they'd installed weeks ago. Transfer papers are being signed, she reported. Agent Rodriguez, are your teams in position? Across the restaurant, Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his tie, the gesture serving to activate his concealed microphone. All units standing by. Let them finish their performance. Rodriguez had been tracking Claire's activities across 3 continents. Pierce Innovations wasn't her first target, but if they played this right, it would be her last. Sir, Sarah spoke into her comm. Mrs. Pierce is accessing her secure email. Should I intercept? Nathan's voice came through, calm and measured. Let it through. Time to see who else is involved in their little scheme. Sarah tracked the email's path as it bounced through servers in Dubai, Singapore, and finally to a private account in Switzerland. The encryption was sophisticated, but she prepared for this. Breaking through their security now, she murmured. These people think they're clever, but they're using a predictable pattern. Got it. The decrypted files painted a devastating picture. Photos, bank statements, corporate documents, evidence of similar takeovers spanning years. But something else caught Sarah's attention. Sir, she said urgently, I'm finding references to previous operations. Other companies, other victims, and death certificates. Too many to be coincidental. Nathan's voice remained steady. Document everything. Agent Rodriguez needs a complete paper trail. In the restaurant, Claire and James were celebrating their supposed triumph. Sarah watched James pour more champagne, his hand lingering too long on Claire's arm. Their confidence was almost pitiable. The money's moving, Sarah reported, tracking multiple transfers. They're routing it through 17 different shells companies. No, 20. All registered in the past 5 years. Rodriguez's voice cut in. Can you trace the endpoints? Better. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. I can prove Claire Pierce owns all of them. She used the same law firm to set up each company. Sloppy. Through her monitors, Sarah watched Nathan stand to leave. Right on cue, Claire and James began making their own preparations to depart. They had no idea that every cell phone tower between the restaurant and their planned meeting spot was now monitoring their communications. Target vehicles are moving, Rodriguez reported. All units maintain distance. Let's see where our happy couple goes next. Sarah switched to traffic camera feeds, tracking 3 vehicles through Seattle's rain-slicked streets. Claire's Mercedes headed downtown, while James took a more circuitous route toward the harbor. They're splitting up, she noted. Classic misdirection. Stay with Claire, Nathan instructed. James is too cautious to carry anything incriminating. She'll lead us to their documentation. The next hour was a symphony of surveillance. Claire made 3 stops, a private bank, a law office, and finally an unmarked office building near the port. At each location, Sarah's team documented every interaction, every document handled, every call made. Sir, Sarah called up financial records on her screen. I'm seeing a pattern in their previous operations. They don't just steal companies, they destroy them. Systematically drain assets, manipulate stock prices, force bankruptcies. 3 CEOs took their own lives after similar takeovers. Nathan's response was cold. And how many of those were genuine? Sarah dug deeper into Claire's travel records. Matching dates. For suspicious deaths during her business trips in the past 5 years. All ruled accidents, or they took their own lives. All involving wealthy businessmen. Now we know why she was so confident about bankruptcy not bothering me. Nathan's voice held a trace of dark amusement. She expected me to follow her previous victim's example. Rodriguez cut in. We've got movement. Claire's meeting someone at the Riverside office complex. Male, mid-50s, carrying a briefcase. Known associate of several criminal enterprises. That's Marcus Weber. Sarah identified him quickly. Professional money launderer. We've been trying to catch him for years. Through surveillance cameras, they watched Claire hand Weber a thick envelope. His laptop opened, fingers flying across keys as he began transferring funds. He's good, Sarah admitted, tracking the transactions. But I'm better. Her own programs began intercepting and documenting every keystroke, every transfer, every account number. Got you, she whispered as the final pieces fell into place. Years of financial crimes, laid bare in strings of numbers and account transfers. Meanwhile, James had reached his own destination, a private marina where a yacht waited. Sarah's facial recognition software identified 3 known criminals among the crew. Their escape plan, Rodriguez observed. Classic route to international waters, then vanish with the money. Not happening tonight. Nathan's voice came through again. Sarah, what's the total? She calculated quickly. Based on currently tracked transfers, just over $300 million. Multiple companies, multiple victims. And that's just what we can prove so far. Enough for RICO charges, Rodriguez confirmed. We've got them. The night wore on. Claire and James eventually reunited at an upscale hotel, clearly pleased with themselves. Sarah's surveillance captured their conversation in the bar. To the end of Pierce Innovations, Claire raised her glass, smirking. And its foolishly trusting founder. James clinked his glass against hers. You played him perfectly, my dear. Though I almost felt bad for him with those roses. Please, Claire rolled her eyes. He was always too sentimental. That's what made him such an easy mark. Just like the others. Speaking of others, James leaned closer. Weber confirmed the transfers are processing. By morning, Nathan won't even be able to afford a cup of coffee. Sarah switched off the audio, her disgust evident. Sir, we have enough. Multiple confessions, documented transfers, connection to previous victims. Not yet. Nathan's voice was steel. Let them finish their performance. Tomorrow, they'll try to access the company accounts. That's when they'll learn what real bankruptcy feels like. Through the night, Sarah monitored their activities while completing her final report. The evidence was damning. Years of careful manipulation, stolen fortunes, destroyed lives, and a trail of convenient deaths. Sir, she said softly, about Claire's previous husbands. I know. Nathan's response held no emotion. I've known for weeks. That's why we had to let this play out exactly as they planned. Trying to stop them too early would have just sent them underground. Dawn approached. Claire and James, confident in their victory, finally retired to their separate rooms. They'd want to maintain appearances until the takeover was complete. Sarah began compiling the final evidence package for the FBI. Financial records, surveillance footage, intercepted communications, offshore account details, everything needed to ensure that this time, Claire's victims would see justice. It's ready, she reported. Agent Rodriguez can move whenever you give the word. Nathan's response was immediate. Not yet. Let them try to access the company accounts first. I want them to feel what real helplessness is like. Sarah understood. This wasn't just about justice, it was about showing Claire and James exactly who they'd underestimated. Morning would bring Act 3, but that would be another chapter. For now, the trap was set, the evidence gathered, and the predators were about to learn what it felt like to be prey. Through her monitors, Sarah watched the hotel's darkness. In separate rooms, Claire and James slept peacefully, dreaming of their ill-gotten wealth. They had no idea that their empire of lies was about to crumble. Sleep well, Sarah murmured, sending the final evidence package to her secure server. Tomorrow's going to be a very long day. In his office, Nathan reviewed the surveillance footage one last time. Every betrayal, every smirk, every confident boast, all recorded and documented. His expression remained impassive, but his eyes held the cold satisfaction of a man who had outmaneuvered his would-be destroyers. The city lights flickered like stars through his window as he considered tomorrow's events. Claire and James thought they were masters of manipulation, experts at destroying lives for profit. They were about to learn that some people don't break when betrayed, they get even. Dawn was approaching, bringing with it the final act of this elaborate performance. But that would be another story, for another time. For now, the pieces were in place, the evidence secured, and justice waited in the wings. The night's rain had stopped, leaving Seattle's streets gleaming like black glass. In her office, Sarah Chin finally allowed herself to rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The monitors continued their silent vigilance, recording every movement, every transaction, every piece of evidence that would ensure Claire and James would never destroy another life. 1 week after the restaurant meeting, dawn broke over Seattle's private airfield. Claire Pierce checked her Cartier watch, a gift Nathan had given her for their 15th anniversary. In 30 minutes, her private jet would take off for Dubai, leaving behind the ashes of Pierce Innovations. Final checks complete. Mrs. Pierce, the pilot reported. We're cleared for takeoff. Claire nodded, her designer heels clicking across the tarmac. Everything had gone perfectly. The company accounts were drained, assets transferred, and Nathan. Well, Nathan would soon be yesterday's news. Her phone buzzed. James. Minor delay accessing the last account. Systems acting strange. Claire frowned. James wasn't supposed to access anything until she was safely out of U.S. airspace. Wait for my signal, she texted back. The first sign something was wrong came when she noticed 2 black SUVs pulling onto the tarmac. Then another pair appeared, blocking the runway. Mrs. Pierce? Agent Rodriguez stepped out, badge glinting in the morning sun. I'm afraid your flight's been canceled. Claire's hand moved toward her purse, but a female agent was already there, removing the gun Claire thought no one knew about. Claire Pierce, Rodriguez continued, you're under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent. Across town, James Harrison stared at his computer screen in disbelief. Every account was locked, not just frozen, completely inaccessible. His override codes, backdoors, everything, useless. Going somewhere? Sarah Chin's voice made him spin around. FBI agents filed into his office. This is ridiculous, James blustered. I'm the CFO of Pierce Innovations. I have every right to commit fraud. Sarah held up a tablet displaying his account transfers. To assist in multiple murders? Interesting interpretation of fiduciary duty. As agents led him out, James caught sight of Nathan standing in the doorway. You knew, James realized. How long? Long enough. Nathan's voice was cold. By the way, those adjusted numbers you showed the banks? They've been very interested in the real ones. The arrests made international headlines within hours. Black Widow CEO caught in international sting. Corporate killing spree ends. Power couple faces lie. Pierce Innovations founder exposes murderous fraud scheme. At FBI headquarters, Claire sat in interrogation, her perfect composure finally cracking as Rodriguez laid out photograph after photograph. Martin Weber, your first husband, Rodriguez placed the photo. Car accident, 2015. Brake lines mysteriously failed. Claire's manicured nail tapped the table. Tragic accident. Alexander Chun, husband number 2. 2017. Apparent self-immolation except, you have nothing, Claire snapped, but her voice wavered. We have everything. Rodriguez spread out more photos. Businessmen, all dead. All connected to Claire's business trips. Your other victims' families are very interested in reopening these investigations. The death penalty is still active in several of these jurisdictions. Claire's face went ash white. 2 rooms over, James was crumbling even faster. It was all her idea, he babbled. Claire approached me 3 years ago. Said she had a system, foolproof. Target successful companies, use inside information to acquire control, drain the assets. And the deaths? Sarah Chun asked quietly. I didn't know at first. James wiped his forehead. I thought they were just financial takeovers. But then I saw patterns. Claire's business trips always seemed to coincide with accidents. How many others? At least 12 companies. But the murders? God, I don't even know the full count. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's team had tracked every transaction, every shell company, every offshore account. The total stolen, over $300 million. The human cost, immeasurable. 3 months later, Claire paced her prison cell, her Prada suits replaced by orange coveralls. Her carefully constructed world had shattered. Other inmates whispered about the Black Widow, the woman who killed husbands for profit. The guard found her on a Tuesday morning, unresponsive. The inquiry revealed a poison capsule, somehow smuggled in. Even in death, Claire demanded control. James received 30 years. No poison pills for him, just decades to reflect on choosing the wrong partner in crime. Nathan rebuilt Pierce Innovations, emerging stronger from the crucible of betrayal. The company's new transparency measures became industry standard. Sarah Chun, promoted to COO, helped implement systems protecting other firms from similar schemes. Occasionally, Nathan visited James in prison. Not for closure, Nathan had never needed that. He went to remind James that while some people built things of value, others only knew how to destroy. Claire's death became a cautionary tale in business schools worldwide. Students studied how ambition unchecked by ethics inevitably self-destructed. Her detailed journals, discovered after her death, revealed a sociopath's calculating mind. She'd started small in college, manipulating wealthy students for profit. Each success fed her hunger for more. The FBI created a specialized task force, using lessons from the Pierce case to identify similar long-term corporate infiltration schemes. Agent Rodriguez led the unit, with Sarah Chen consulting on financial forensics. Pierce Innovations' medical devices went on to save thousands of lives. Nathan found poetry in that how an attempt to destroy his life's work had instead made it stronger. The trick, he told young entrepreneurs at a conference, isn't just watching your business partners. It's watching their partners. Trust, but verify. Then verify again. In the end, Claire's elaborate scheme accomplished something she never intended. It created a template for protecting honest businesses from predators like herself. The roses Nathan had brought to La Maison Rouge that night were pressed between the pages of the FBI's case file. A reminder that appearances deceive, and that justice, like revenge, was best served cold. Epilogue. Years later, a reporter asked Nathan if he regretted not catching Claire sooner, before other victims suffered. "Regret is useless," he replied. "I saw a threat to everything I'd built. I eliminated it. Business is simple that way." The reporter noted he didn't sound like a man who'd lost his wife. "I lost nothing," Nathan corrected. "I removed a cancer before it could destroy what I spent my life building. The only one who lost was Claire, she just didn't know it until the end." Sarah Chun kept the surveillance recordings from that final night at La Maison Rouge. Sometimes, training new security teams, she played Claire's confident pronunciation of doom, followed by the moment she realized her own hubris had destroyed her. James Harrison served his time in solitude, abandoned by his co-conspirator's death. The only visitor he received was Nathan, whose yearly appearances served as a reminder. Some debts could never be repaid. Pierce Innovations' stock price tripled within a year of Claire's arrest. The company's new corporate governance model, designed by Sarah Chun, became known as the Pierce Protocol, a systematic defense against long-term corporate infiltration. Nathan never remarried. His company became his legacy, its life-saving innovations his answer to Claire's dedication to destruction. He kept no photos of her, no mementos of their 18 years together. But he did keep one thing: the knowledge that he'd turned her own weapon patience against her. The final page of the FBI file contained a note from Claire, written the night before her death. Nathan didn't win because he was smarter. He won because he was willing to wait longer for revenge than I was willing to wait for victory. She was wrong, of course. Nathan hadn't waited for revenge. He'd waited for justice. And justice, unlike Claire, had infinite patience. Epilogue. A decade of consequences. 10 years had passed since the fall of Claire Pierce and James Harrison. Their stories still echoed through corporate boardrooms and law enforcement training sessions, a cautionary tale of hubris and its inevitable price. Marcus Rodriguez, now deputy director of the FBI's Corporate Crimes Division, kept a framed news article on his office wall. Black Widow CEO's empire of deception crumbles. It served as a reminder that the most dangerous predators often wore designer suits and carried platinum cards. The Pierce case changed everything, he explained to new recruits. It wasn't just about corporate fraud anymore. It showed us how patient psychopaths could weaponize legitimate business practices. The task force he created, nicknamed Operation Phoenix, after Pierce Innovations' rise from the ashes, had prevented 17 similar schemes in the past decade. Every potential Claire Pierce was now flagged by an algorithm Sarah Chun had developed, tracking patterns of corporate infiltration and suspicious deaths. James Harrison's life had taken a different trajectory. Prison had not been kind to the former CFO. His initial bravado crumbled within months, replaced by a haunted look that deepened with each passing year. Other inmates, many of whom had lost family savings to corporate fraudsters, ensured his stay was especially uncomfortable. During Nathan's annual visits, James had aged decades. His perfectly coiffed hair had gone gray, his confident smirk replaced by nervous twitches. He'd tried writing a memoir, seeking profit from his crimes, but Nathan's legal team had secured an injunction. Every cent James might ever earn would go to his victims' families. You know what the worst part is? James had asked during Nathan's last visit. She never cared about me either. I found letters in her private files. She was already planning to frame me for everything. I would have been just another self-immolation in her body count. Nathan had simply watched him through the glass, neither offering comfort nor showing satisfaction. James had chosen his path, chosen to help destroy lives for profit. His regrets meant nothing. Claire's legacy proved even darker. Post-mortem psychological analysis of her journals revealed a methodical sociopath who had started manipulating and destroying lives in high school. Her college years included 3 suspicious deaths of wealthy students who'd accidentally drowned after changing their wills in her favor. The poison pill that ended her life had been her final manipulation. Investigation revealed she'd arranged its delivery through a complex network of compromised prison staff and former associates. Even her self-immolation was designed to deny others the satisfaction of justice. But her death brought forward scores of witnesses who'd feared her while she lived. The full scope of her operations emerged: 23 companies destroyed, 18 deaths ruled accidents or self-immolations, and hundreds of millions in stolen assets hidden in accounts across the globe. She was a statistical anomaly, Sarah Chin explained at a cybersecurity conference. Most corporate criminals want profit. Claire wanted destruction. The money was just her scorecard. Sarah had transformed Pierce Innovations' security division into a global consultancy. The Pierce Protocol, her corporate defense system, had become the gold standard for protecting companies against long-term infiltration. She'd recently turned down a presidential appointment to remain at Pierce Innovations, telling reporters, "Some debts can only be repaid by preventing history from repeating." Pierce Innovations itself had emerged stronger, its medical devices saving lives in hospitals worldwide. The company's transparency measures attracted ethical investors and talented employees who valued integrity over quick profits. Nathan had transformed his personal tragedy into a force for positive change, though those who knew him well recognized that transformation was fueled by cold calculation rather than altruism. The company's headquarters now included a secure room known as the Archive. Inside, Sarah maintained records of every corporate infiltration scheme they'd helped expose. Claire and James occupied the first display, their story serving as training material for corporate security teams. The fascinating thing, Sarah told her students, wasn't just the complexity of their scheme. It was how simple its prevention could have been. One person asking the right questions at the right time could have stopped them years earlier. Nathan Pierce's own evolution was perhaps the most intriguing. He'd emerged from betrayal not bitter, but more sharply focused. His annual prison visits to James weren't about closure, they were reminders to others that betrayal carried consequences. When asked about Claire, his responses were clinical, analytical. She thought she was special, he'd tell business students. She didn't realize that patient, methodical destruction could be met with patient, methodical justice. The roses from that final dinner at La Maison Rouge had been preserved by the FBI's forensics lab. They sat in a clear case in Rodriguez's office, next to Claire's self-immolation note and James's confession. Together, they told a story of trust weaponized and justice served cold. Perhaps the most lasting impact was on corporate culture itself. The Pierce effect became business terminology for the implementation of systematic protections against trust-based infiltration. Companies worldwide adopted variations of Sarah's security protocols, creating interlocking systems of verification that made long-term corporate deception increasingly difficult. The victims' families had eventually received justice, though not all found peace. Nathan had established a foundation providing support for families affected by corporate fraud, funded by recovered assets from Claire's hidden accounts. The foundation specialized in detecting signs of corporate psychopathy before it claimed lives. La Maison Rouge itself had changed hands, the new owners unaware their private dining room had hosted the beginning of Claire's end. But some of the old staff remembered, and they'd point out the table to federal agents who occasionally visited, studying the stage where justice began its patient work. James Harrison's 30-year sentence continued grinding away. He tried appealing, claiming he'd been manipulated by Claire, but the evidence Sarah had gathered proved his willing participation. His prison counselor noted he still woke screaming some nights, haunted by the faces of executives whose deaths he'd helped orchestrate. Claire's other victims emerged from shadows cast by her crimes. Support groups formed, sharing stories of manipulation and near destruction. Their testimonies helped strengthen corporate security laws, closing loopholes Claire had exploited. Her methods became red flags, studied by forensic accountants and corporate security experts. Nathan had indeed never remarried, but not from lingering attachment. Marriage is a partnership, he'd explained to a journalist. I prefer partnerships with clear performance metrics and exit clauses. His focus remained on building something lasting, something that could withstand any attempt at infiltration or destruction. Pierce Innovation's latest medical breakthrough, a neural implant helping paralyzed patients walk again, stood as testament to what could be built from the ashes of betrayal. The company's research division, now the largest in the industry, maintained one rule above all others. Trust must be earned daily, verified hourly, and never taken for granted. Sarah Chin's security algorithms continued evolving, learning from each attempt at corporate infiltration they detected. She'd created an AI system nicknamed Claire, not from sentiment, but as a reminder that the most dangerous predators could be identified by their patterns. The FBI task force expanded globally, sharing data with international agencies tracking similar schemes. They'd prevented billions in corporate theft, saved countless lives from destruction, and most importantly, taught businesses to recognize the warning signs of methodical infiltration. Rodriguez, approaching retirement, had trained a new generation of agents in what he called Pierce awareness, the understanding that corporate crimes weren't just about money, but about power and destruction. His team had developed psychological profiles helping identify potential Claires before they could fully implement their schemes. James Harrison's prison cell contained one personal item, a newspaper clipping about Pierce Innovation's success, not from pride in what he'd helped build, but as a reminder of what he'd tried to destroy. His prison counselor noted it represented progress from denying his crimes to acknowledging their impact. The roses in Rodriguez's office dried but never crumbled, preserved in their clear case like a museum piece. They remained as Claire remained in corporate memory, a beautiful warning of trust misplaced and justice served. Their thorns, still sharp after a decade, reminded visitors that beauty often concealed danger. Nathan Pierce's office overlooked a changed Seattle skyline. Pierce Innovation's new headquarters dominated the view, its transparent glass design a physical manifestation of the company's commitment to visibility and accountability. From his desk, he could see the harbor where Claire had planned her escape, now home to a Pierce Innovations research center. The simple truth, he told corporate security directors, is that trust is a weapon. In the right hands, it builds empires. In the wrong hands, it destroys them. The key isn't avoiding trust, it's verifying it. Continuously, methodically, patiently. 10 years after Claire's fall, her story had become more than a cautionary tale. It was a blueprint for protection, a lesson in patience, and a reminder that justice, like vengeance, was best served cold. The price of trust had been paid in full.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.
I swear I didn't go looking for anything that night. I just woke up. No reason, just one of those random wake-ups in the middle of the night. The bedroom was dark except for the soft glow of her phone screen on the nightstand. I wouldn't have even noticed it if it hadn't lit up right as I rolled over. Isabel's phone, unattended, unlocked. And there it was, a message. "I can't wait to see you, you're amazing." It wasn't from anyone I knew. Declan Miller, not a name that rang any bells. My heart sank, and a strange numbness crept over me. I sat up, trying to keep my breathing even. My first thought was maybe it was some harmless mistake, like spam or a wrong number. But the way my gut twisted told me otherwise. I should have put the phone down right then and there. But I couldn't. I tapped the message, and everything spilled out in front of me. Weeks of chat logs, flirty messages, intimate pictures exchanged late at night. "Had such a good time last Thursday," one message read. That was the night Isabel told me she was working late. Another message referred to that beach trip. I remembered it perfectly. It was our daughter Lydia's 8th birthday weekend. I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling deeper, my hands cold and clammy. She had spent that whole weekend acting normal. No, better than normal. I remembered her holding Lydia's hand as they walked along the shoreline, laughing at my terrible attempts at kite flying. She even pulled me in for a photo that day, planting a kiss on my cheek. But here, in these messages, she was talking about that same weekend as if it had been some secret getaway with him. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. My wife wasn't just texting some guy. She was sleeping with him. I could hear her slow, steady breathing next to me, completely unaware that I was unraveling right there in the dark. Every instinct screamed at me to wake her up, shove the phone in her face, demand answers. But I didn't. I forced myself to put the phone back exactly where it was and lay down, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay calm, Caleb. Don't tip her off." When the alarm went off the next morning, I was already awake. I dragged myself out of bed, heading straight to the kitchen to make breakfast, just like I always did. Isabel strolled in a little later, looking refreshed, a sleepy smile on her face. She kissed me on the cheek like nothing had happened. "Morning, babe," she said cheerfully, pulling out plates from the cupboard. "Morning," I replied, my voice tighter than I'd intended. She didn't notice. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table with Lydia, who was excitedly telling her about some projects she was working on at school. I tried to focus on their conversation, but my mind was a storm of questions. Isabel looked so normal. How could she sit there, all smiles, chatting with our daughter after spending nights in another man's bed? She glanced at me, her expression relaxed and content, as if everything in our world was perfectly fine. For a split second, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the weight of the truth settled back over me like a stone tied to my chest. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, watching Isabel with new eyes. I noticed things I hadn't before, or maybe I'd just ignored them. She stayed late at work a lot. When she got home, she was quick to give me a peck on the lips and disappear into her phone. I'd asked her a few times why she seemed so distant, but she always had some excuse, just tired or work's been crazy. But now, with what I knew, it was clear. I wasn't the problem. She had someone else. At one point during the day, I wandered out into the front yard. Martina Campbell, our neighbor, was watering her garden and waved me over. "Hey, Caleb, Isabel's been looking great lately. That new hair color really suits her." New hair color? I blinked, thrown off for a moment. Isabel hadn't mentioned getting her hair done. "Yeah, it does," I mumbled, playing along, but Martina's words made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the hair, it was everything. Her clothes had changed too. More form-fitting, more daring. I thought it was just her trying to feel good about herself again after having Lydia. But now, with everything I'd uncovered, it felt like I'd been living in some parallel version of our life. One where everything was the same on the surface, but underneath, things were rotten. I could have confronted her that night. Every time she glanced at her phone, I felt a sharp sting in my chest, wondering if it was him texting her. But something held me back. I needed more than just a gut feeling and a few texts. If I exploded on her now, she'd just lie and twist things around. I needed proof. So I played the waiting game. I didn't change my behavior, didn't treat her any differently, at least not in ways she'd notice. But every time she left her phone lying around, I'd sneak a quick look, gathering as much as I could. I also installed a tracking app, one of those hidden ones that mirrored her phone notifications to mine. Now, I would see everything she did in real time. That night, I lay beside her again, wide awake while she slept soundly next to me. Her hand rested lightly on my chest like it always did, and for a second, I felt a pang of something close to guilt. What if I was wrong? What if there was some explanation for all this? But then I remembered those messages, those goddamn photos of them together. The way he talked about her, like she was his. No, Caleb, you're not crazy. She's the one betraying you. Still, it was surreal. Isabel had been my best friend, the woman I thought I'd grow old with. And now, every time I looked at her, all I saw was lies. Lydia's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, her little brows furrowed with concern. I forced a smile. "Yes, sweetie, just thinking about stuff." She nodded, but the look in her eyes told me she knew something was off. And so the first cracks began to form, not just in my marriage, but in my whole life. I didn't confront her right away. Part of me wanted to throw the phone in her face, scream at her, and demand answers. But I knew how these things went. If I acted on impulse, she'd lie, twist things around, turn it back on me. No, I needed to be smart about this. I needed proof. So I waited. I played dumb. I kept my routine exactly the same. The night after I found the messages, I installed a hidden app on her phone. It was one of those discreet ones that mirrored all her texts and notifications to mine. Every time her phone buzzed, I got a notification too. It made me sick to my stomach, knowing that her next message could be from him. But I needed to see everything. I also checked our shared photo album and the GPS history on her phone, digging through every detail I could find. The pattern became obvious pretty quickly. Isabel had a habit of visiting Riverside, a neighborhood across town. There was no reason for her to be there. None that she'd ever mentioned anyway. I could only guess that's where Declan lived. Every time she was working late or out with friends, she ended up there. It was like living in someone else's nightmare. I'd sit at work, phone in hand, watching notifications roll in, pretending like everything was fine while my wife was out there with him. One time, when I saw she'd arrived in Riverside again, I clenched my phone so hard I thought it might shatter. The worst part wasn't the messages or the photos. It was how comfortable they were with each other. They talked about inside jokes, shared little stories from their days, things that she used to share with me. The emotional connection stung almost worse than the physical betrayal. Then came the night she said she was going to yoga with one of her friends. Isabel rarely went to yoga, and when she did, it was always on weekends. My gut told me something was off. "Yoga class tonight?" I asked casually, leaning against the kitchen counter as she packed her gym bag. "Yeah," she said without missing a beat. "It's been a while. Emma keeps bugging me to come with her." I gave her a nod and forced a smile. "Have fun." As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice, if she even cared enough to look. Sure enough, she didn't go to any yoga studio. I followed her all the way to a small cafe tucked into the corner of Riverside. And there he was, Declan. She spotted him the moment she walked in, her whole face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. She slid into the booth across from him, and the two of them leaned in close, their legs brushing under the table. They were laughing, touching hands, acting like giddy teenagers sneaking out of class. She looked happy. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Watching them like that, it felt like someone had reached into my chest and crushed my heart. Seeing her with him, so at ease, so free, was worse than anything I could have imagined. I wanted to storm in, flip the table, and confront them both right there. But I didn't. I just sat there, paralyzed, watching them flirt and touch like it was the most natural thing in the world. When she finally left the cafe, she had a glow about her. The same glow she used to have when we first started dating. But now it wasn't for me. It was for him. That night, I lay beside her again, wide awake while she slept like nothing had happened. Her breathing was soft and steady, and her hand brushed against mine under the blanket. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever be able to forgive her. Could I really move past this? Could I ever look at her the same way again? I didn't have an answer. Over the next few days, Isabel started picking up on my mood. I could see her eyes lingering on me longer, watching for any sign that something was off. I did my best to act normal, but it wasn't easy. I kept getting lost in my own thoughts, replaying every moment of our relationship in my head, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. I spent more time at work, throwing myself into projects that didn't even matter. When I was home, I'd stay late in the garage, tinkering with tools I hadn't touched in years. "Everything okay, Caleb?" she asked one evening as I stood at the sink, scrubbing a dish that was already clean. "Yeah, just tired," I mumbled. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't push. "Not yet." Lydia was the only one brave enough to call me out on it. One night, as I tucked her in a bed, she looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes of hers. "Dad, why are you sad?" she asked, her little voice full of concern. I felt my throat tighten. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," I lied, brushing a hand over her hair. "Just thinking about grown-up stuff." She didn't look convinced, but she snuggled deeper into her blankets and let it go. Isabel, on the other hand, was getting suspicious. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out what was going on with me. She started asking more questions, trying to engage me in conversations that felt forced. She'd sit next to me on the couch, curling into my side, asking about my day like she gave a damn. It was like she was trying to feel me out, figure out if I knew anything. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, I distanced myself even further. I kept my answers short and vague, just enough to keep her from digging too deep. The less I said, the more uncomfortable she got. She knew something was up, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. And that was exactly what I wanted. The dynamic in our house shifted. Where once there had been laughter and easy conversations, there was now tension, thick and suffocating. Every interaction felt like a test, a game of chess where we both tried to outmaneuver each other without saying what we really meant. I spent more nights in the garage pretending to work on meaningless projects. Sometimes I'd just sit there, staring at the tools scattered across the workbench, thinking about how my life had turned into this mess. I used to love being home, love spending time with my family. Now it felt like a battleground, and every moment with Isabel was another reminder of how everything I thought we had was a lie. And yet, I still wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more. I needed her to feel just as vulnerable as I did, to wonder what I knew and when I might finally explode. The waiting game was brutal, but it was the only way I could stay in control. She thought she had the upper hand, thought I was clueless. But the truth was, I was watching her every move, tracking her every step. And when the time came, I'd be ready. Exposing Isabel's affair wouldn't be enough. I could see that clearly now. I could catch her red-handed, throw every bit of evidence in her face, and watch her squirm. But what would that change? She'd be embarrassed, sure, but she wouldn't feel what I felt. She wouldn't know what it's like to be gutted from the inside out, watching the person you love turn their affection towards someone else. No, that wasn't enough. I needed her to feel everything I was feeling. I didn't plan on meeting Savannah Marlowe. It just happened. The bar was close to my office, and one night after a particularly shitty day, I stopped in, hoping a drink might dull some of the noise in my head. Savannah was working the bar, wiping down glasses with an easy smile that lit up her whole face. She looked young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail and tattoos peeking out from under her sleeves. "What'll it be?" she asked, glancing at me with a curious grin, like she knew I didn't belong there. "Bourbon," I muttered, sliding onto a stool. She poured my drink and set it down with a little more grace than I'd expected. "Rough day?" I just nodded. I wasn't in the mood to talk, but Savannah had a way of pulling words out of me without even trying. She didn't pry. She just talked about her day, the weird customers she'd dealt with, and how she was saving up to travel the country in a beat-up and she was fixing up with her brother. I found myself opening up, telling her little bits about my life, how work had been dragging, how things at home weren't great. I didn't mention Isabel. Not yet. I didn't need to. Savannah had this easy way about her that made it feel like none of that mattered in the moment. I went back to the bar the next night, and the night after that. Before long, stopping by for a drink became part of my routine. At first, I told myself it was innocent, just someone to talk to, someone who didn't know the mess my life had become. But with each visit, the flirting between us grew more obvious. Savannah would lean in closer when she spoke, her hand brushing mine as she passed me my drink. And I didn't pull away. She never asked too many questions, Just let me be whoever I needed to be in that moment. When she laughed, it felt real, like she wasn't holding back for anyone. Being around her was a relief, like I could step out of my own skin for a little while and just breathe. One night, after a few drinks, she leaned on the bar, her eyes locking onto mine. "You know, I don't see guys like you in here very often." "Guys like me?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You look like you've got your shit together," she said with a smirk. "But there's something else. Something heavy." I just shrugged, swirling the bourbon in my glass. "Life, I guess." She didn't press, just smiled, that easy smile of hers. "Well, here's to life." She clinked her glass against mine, and for a moment, the weight on my chest didn't feel quite as heavy. I wasn't stupid. I knew what I was doing. I wasn't just hanging out at the bar for the atmosphere. I wanted Isabel to find out. I wanted her to wonder what I was up to when I wasn't home, to feel that same creeping suspicion I'd lived with for months. It didn't take long for the rumors to start spreading. I started dropping hints to mutual friends, nothing obvious, just little comments here and there. "I've been spending time with someone new," I'd say casually, knowing the gossip would spread like wildfire. I didn't care who knew. In fact, the more people who knew, the better. One evening, I ran into Martina Campbell at the bar. She nearly dropped her drink when she saw me sitting there, chatting with Savannah like we were old friends. "Caleb," she asked, eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Having a drink," I replied with a shrug, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Martina looked from me to Savannah and back again, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Does Isabel know you're here?" I gave her a smile, the kind that wasn't really a smile at all. "Why? You gonna tell her?" Martina blinked, clearly thrown off by my tone. This isn't like you, Caleb. People change," I said flatly, raising my glass to my lips. Martina huffed, crossing her arms. "She's your wife, Caleb." "Yeah, well, I'm sure Isabel's doing just fine without me," I said, my voice laced with bitterness. Martina stared at me for a moment, her expression shifting from shock to something more like pity. "I'm going to talk to her," she said finally, as if she thought she could fix whatever was happening between us. "Go ahead," I muttered, not bothering to stop her. "Let her talk. Let Isabel know exactly where I was, who I was with." Savannah raised an eyebrow as Martina stormed out of the bar, shaking her head. "Friend of yours?" "Something like that," I said, finishing my drink. Savannah didn't ask any more questions. She just smiled, and we went back to talking about nothing and everything like we always did. That night, as I drove home, a strange kind of satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't just about getting back at Isabel. It was about reclaiming a part of myself that I'd lost somewhere along the way. I didn't know where this thing with Savannah was going, and honestly, I didn't care. All I knew was that for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had some control. I wanted Isabel to feel the same gut-wrenching uncertainty I'd felt. I wanted her to wonder if I was thinking about someone else when I kissed her goodnight. And if Martina's reaction was anything to go by, I was well on my way to making that happen. The game had only just begun, and for the first time in months, I wasn't playing defense anymore. It happened sooner than I expected. One night, while I was at the bar with Savannah, enjoying the rare sensation of lightness, Isabel stormed in. I didn't see her coming. 1 second, Savannah and I were laughing over some silly joke, and the next, I heard Isabel's voice cut through the low hum of the bar like a blade. "So this is where you've been hiding." I looked up, and there she was, Isabel, standing in the entrance, scanning the room until her eyes locked on mine. Her face twisted in rage, lips pressed into a tight line. She marched toward us like a woman possessed, fury radiating off her. Every head in the bar turned as she approached. "Who the fuck is she?" Isabel demanded, pointing at Savannah with a wild look in her eyes. Her voice was loud, sharp, and bitter, impossible to ignore. Savannah froze, visibly uncomfortable, her carefree demeanor evaporating in an instant. She shot me a glance, clearly wondering what kind of mess she had just walked into. "Isabel, don't do this here," I said, keeping my voice even, though my heart was pounding in my chest. She wasn't having any of it. She stepped closer, glaring at Savannah. "You think this is funny? Flirting with a married man? You think that's cute?" Savannah raised her hands defensively and stood up. "I didn't know." "Bullshit." Isabel snapped, cutting her off. Don't act like some innocent bystander. Isabel, I warned, back off. Isabel ignored me. She turned to the growing crowd of onlookers, her voice growing louder. This asshole's been sneaking around behind my back, cheating on me with this tramp. I leaned back in my seat, arms crossed, forcing myself to stay calm. This was what she wanted, to make me react, to make me feel like I was the one at fault. How does it feel? I asked, keeping my eyes locked on hers. How does it feel to be betrayed? She faltered for a moment, taken off guard. For a second, I saw it, the guilt, the fear, before the mask slipped back into place. You ruined this family, Caleb, she hissed, her voice low but venomous. I stood slowly, making sure to keep my movements deliberate. No, Isabel, I said calmly. You ruined it the moment you started fucking Declan. The bar went dead silent. Martina, who had been sitting at the other end of the bar, stared at us, wide-eyed. She looked like she was watching a slow-motion car crash and couldn't tear her eyes away. Isabel's face paled for just a second, but then she snarled, "That's different. He was just a distraction." Savannah, embarrassed and clearly wanting no part in this disaster, muttered, "I think I should go." She grabbed her things and slipped away, leaving me and Isabel standing in the center of the room, surrounded by people who were now witnessing the complete unraveling of our marriage. Isabel turned back to me, eyes wild. "You're a coward, Caleb. You sneak around and flirt with some bar girl to make yourself feel better? That's fucking pathetic." I smiled bitterly, not rising to her bait. Is it? Or is it just karma? When we got home, the argument exploded into full force. Isabel slammed the door behind her and spun around to face me. "You really think flirting with some bartender makes you a man?" she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "You think this is how you solve our problems?" "No, Isabel," I said quietly. "But it sure as hell feels good to watch you squirm." She glared at me, her chest heaving. "Declan didn't mean anything. I was lonely, Caleb. You were never there for me." "Don't give me that crap," I shot back. "You chose to cheat. Don't try to twist it into something it's not." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sorry for her. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the folder where I'd saved everything, and held it up. "You want to explain these? The photos? The messages? Or maybe the GPS pings showing every time you went to Riverside?" Her face crumbled as she realized there was no way out. She wasn't in control anymore. Her excuses, her lies, they all fell apart in an instant. "It was just a distraction," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Well, congrats," I said, my voice cold. "You distracted yourself out of a marriage." She sobbed, clinging to whatever shred of dignity she had left. "Kayla, please. I didn't mean for it to go this far. We can fix this. We can try again." But I was done. Whatever love I had for her had been eaten away by months of lies and betrayal. Martina showed up at the house the next day, hoping to mediate or talk some sense into me. She sat me down at the kitchen table, her expression full of concern. "I know you're hurt, Caleb, but maybe there's still something worth saving. For Lydia's sake, if nothing else." I shook my head. "I can't live like this, Martina. I can't wake up every day wondering if she's lying to me again. I won't do it." "People make mistakes," Martina said softly. "Isabel, she's just human. She made her choice," I replied, my voice firm. "And I'm making mine." Martina sighed, realizing there was nothing more to say. "I just hate to see things end like this." "Trust me," I muttered. It ended the day she decided to crawl into bed with someone else. Martina left not long after, leaving me alone in the silence of the house. Isabel was there somewhere, probably crying, probably coming up with new excuses or apologies. But none of it mattered anymore. The trust was gone, and once that's gone, there's no getting it back. There was a strange sense of clarity in knowing that. I knew it was time. There was no point dragging this out any longer. The lies, the betrayal, it had all hollowed out whatever love I had left for Isabel. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the same way. Now, I just felt exhausted, like I'd been running a marathon with no finish line in sight. But this dinner would be the end. I'd made up my mind. I would hand her the divorce papers, close the book on us, and finally be free. I booked a table at the restaurant where we had celebrated our first anniversary all those years ago. I didn't choose it for sentimental reasons. I chose it because it felt symbolic, a way to bring things full circle and finally lay them to rest. This marriage had been dead for a while now. It was just time to make it official. That evening, as I pulled on my jacket, Lydia stood in the doorway of my room, clutching one of her stuffed animals. Her big, curious eyes watched me closely, and I could see the questions swirling in her little head. "Dad," she said softly, hugging the stuffed bear tighter to her chest. "Do you and Mom still love each other?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, my hands hovering over my collar. And for a second, I didn't know what to say. How do you explain something so complicated to an 8-year-old? I crouched down in front of her, brushing her hair out of her eyes. "Sweetheart," I whispered, "I will always love you. No matter what happens, you are the most important thing in the world to me." She frowned, clearly not satisfied with that answer. "But, do you love Mom?" I hugged her tightly, trying to hold back the knot in my throat. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "grown-ups love each other in different ways. And sometimes, that love changes." Lydia didn't say anything, just rested her head on my shoulder. I held her for a moment longer, wishing I could shield her from the mess that her mother and I had made. "I love you," I whispered into her hair, and I meant it more than anything. That will never change. When I arrived at the restaurant, Isabel was already seated, sipping a glass of water. She smiled when she saw me, but it was strained, like she wasn't sure what kind of conversation we were about to have. I slid into the chair across from her, placing my bag carefully by my side. "Hi," she said cautiously, her eyes scanning my face. "You look nice." I nodded but didn't return the compliment. For a few minutes, we sat in awkward silence. Then, as if trying to bridge the distance between us, Isabel started talking, reminiscing about old times, about when things were good. She mentioned our honeymoon, the first house we bought, Lydia's birth. Moments that, once upon a time, had meant everything to me. But now, they felt like memories that belonged to someone else. I didn't respond much, just sipped my wine and nodded at the right moments. My mind was elsewhere, focused on the papers tucked neatly inside my bag. The longer Isabel talked, the more it became clear that she was desperately trying to hold on to something that was already gone. After a few more minutes of strained conversation, I decided I'd had enough. I reached into my bag, pulled out the divorce papers, and placed them on the table between us. Her smile faltered, and she stared at the papers like they were a bomb about to go off. "This evening doesn't mean anything to me anymore," I said coldly, looking her directly in the eye. Isabel's hand trembled as she reached for the papers. "Kayla, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head, my expression unchanging. "There's nothing left to fix." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel anything. No sympathy, no regret. Just emptiness. "Please," she begged, her voice barely audible. "We can try again. For Lydia. For us." I took the pen from my pocket, clicked it, and signed the papers right in front of her without hesitation. Then, I pushed them across the table and stood. "It's over, Isabel," I said, my voice firm but emotionless. "I can't live like this anymore." She sat there, stunned, her glass of wine half finished, her hands trembling as they hovered over the papers. For a moment, I thought she might say something else. One final plea, one last desperate attempt to change my mind. But she didn't. I turned and walked away without another word, leaving her sitting alone at the table. I didn't look back. I couldn't. In the hallway, just as I reached the exit, I ran into Martina. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and she gave me a look that was equal parts surprise and concern. "Caleb," she said softly, "you really went through with it?" I nodded, my expression unreadable. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked, her voice gentle, as if she thought I might waver at the last second. For the first time in my life, I said quietly, "I am absolutely sure." Martina studied my face for a moment, then gave me a sad smile. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for," she said softly. I didn't respond. I just gave her a small nod and walked out into the night, feeling lighter than I had in months. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph. Just closure. The chapter with Isabel was finally over. Packing my things wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. I'd imagined it might feel heavy, like I was ripping myself away from the life I'd built. But it didn't. It felt necessary, like shedding old skin. The house was too full of memories I didn't want anymore. Isabel's perfume clinging to the furniture, pictures from happier days scattered throughout the place, reminders of every broken promise. I stuffed clothes into bags, loaded a few boxes into the back of my car, and left without ceremony. I moved into a small apartment in the city center. It wasn't fancy, just a one-bedroom with creaky floors and a view of a laundromat. But it was mine. There was something comforting about starting over with nothing but the essentials. No ghosts lurking in the corners. No memories weighing me down. It felt clean. The hardest part was explaining it to Lydia. I promised her I wasn't going anywhere, that we'd still spend weekends together, and that she'd always be my #1 priority. She nodded solemnly, trying to be brave, but I could see the worry in her little face. It killed me that my decisions had hurt her, but I swore to myself that no matter what, I'd be there for her. I wouldn't let her feel abandoned. The weeks after the divorce passed in a strange blur. I focused on work, on making my new place feel like home, and on being the best dad I could be. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't pretending. Then, one rainy afternoon, I ran into Savannah. I was heading back to my apartment, groceries in hand, when I saw her across the street, holding an umbrella and wearing that same easy smile. "Caleb," she called out, jogging over to meet me. "I thought that was you." I couldn't help but grin. "Hey, Savannah." We stood there for a moment, awkward but comfortable at the same time, rain tapping lightly against her umbrella. "You look different," she said, tilting her head as she studied me. "Different how?" I asked. She shrugged. "Lighter. Happier, maybe." I laughed, though it still felt strange to hear someone say that. "Divorce will do that to you, I guess." Her eyes softened. "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be," I said, meaning it. It needed to happen. Savannah smiled, and for a moment, we just stood there in the drizzle, neither of us in a rush to leave. "You want to grab a coffee?" she asked, her tone casual but hopeful. "Yeah," I said. "I'd like that." Coffee turned into more coffee, and before I knew it, meeting Savannah became part of my routine again. It wasn't like before, though. This time, there were no games, no hidden motives. We just talked about life, about her van project, about anything and everything. She didn't press for details about Isabel, and I appreciated that. Being with her felt like a breath of fresh air, like I was finally allowed to move on without dragging the past behind me. One weekend, I had Lydia with me, and we ran into Savannah at the park. Lydia was shy at first, hiding behind my leg, but Savannah crouched down, smiling warmly. "Hey, you must be Lydia," she said. "Your dad's told me all about you." Lydia peeked out, curious but still wary. "He has?" "Yup," Savannah said with a wink. "He said you're the best artist around." That was all it took. Lydia's face lit up, and within minutes, the two of them were sitting together on a bench, talking about crayons and drawing contests. Watching them interact, I felt something settle in my chest, a sense of peace I hadn't known I was missing. Maybe this was what moving on looked like, not just for me, but for Lydia too. Of course, Isabel wasn't finished with me. A few weeks later, she called, asking if we could meet. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. We sat across from each other at a cafe, the same tension between us that had defined the last few months of our marriage. She looked tired, like the weight of her mistakes had finally caught up with her. She began, struggling to find the right words. "I want to say I'm sorry, Caleb. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it." I nodded but said nothing. "I was lonely," she continued, her voice breaking. "I wasn't thinking straight, but I never stopped loving you. Can we try again? For Lydia's sake?" I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Part of me had wondered what this moment would feel like, if I'd feel vindicated or if some small part of me would still want her back. But as I looked at her, I realized I didn't feel any of that. I felt nothing. "Thank you for the experience," I said calmly. "I became stronger because of it. But you stayed in a place I no longer want to be." Her face crumpled, but I didn't waver. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was just done. When I got back to my apartment that evening, Savannah was waiting on the balcony, 2 beers in hand. She smiled as I stepped outside, the cool evening breeze brushing against my skin. "How'd it go?" she asked, handing me a beer. "Exactly how it needed to," I said, sitting beside her. We sat there in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the city flicker on one by one. Savannah reached over and laced her fingers through mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The past didn't matter anymore. It was behind me, right where it belonged. Just as I was about to take another sip of my beer, my phone buzzed. It was a video call from Lydia. "Hey, sweetie," I answered, my voice warm. "Dad, guess what?" she said.